The jacket was the first thing anyone noticed. Faded olive green canvas, blood still wet on the left sleeve, a patch stitched above the breast pocket that nobody in the courtroom recognized. And because they didn't recognize it, they laughed. A trauma nurse, 31 years old, hair still smelling of antiseptic and sweat, standing in a wood-paneled courtroom in Crestfield, Colorado, staring at a federal judge like he was the least interesting thing she'd seen all week. Judge Walter Crane leaned forward from his elevated bench, lips pulled into a smirk that said he'd never once been told no by anyone wearing scrubs. "Remove that jacket," he said. "You're embarrassing this court." Rachel Voss didn't move. "If you've made it this far, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if it moves you, hit like and follow along. You won't want to miss what happens next." The morning had started before sunrise. Not metaphorically. Rachel Voss had been awake since 3:47 a.m. because that was when the radio crackled in the break room at Harlow Memorial Hospital and the charge nurse called a trauma alert. And by the time the paramedics wheeled in the gurney, Rachel was already gloved, already thinking 3 steps ahead. The patient was 11 years old. His name, she would learn later, was Marcus. He'd been in the back seat of his mother's car when a pickup ran a red light at 60 miles an hour. The impact had compressed his chest cavity, fractured 4 ribs, and caused his left lung to partially collapse. His mother hadn't survived the crash. Rachel didn't think about that last part while she worked. You can't, not in those moments. Later, she would sit in her car in the parking garage and think about the way Marcus had looked at her when he woke up, scared, confused, reaching for a hand that wasn't there. And she would hold that for a while. But in the trauma bay, there was only the work. She intubated him, assisted in placing a chest tube, coordinated with the surgeon, and stayed until his oxygen saturation stabilized and his color came back. By the time she stripped her first pair of gloves, it was 6:20 a.m. She had a court appearance at 9. She didn't go home. There wasn't time. She cleaned up in the hospital locker room, changed her scrub top, but kept the olive green jacket because it was the warmest thing she'd brought, and the morning was cold, and honestly, she hadn't slept in 22 hours, and she had approximately 0 bandwidth left to care what it looked like. Her car smelled like coffee she hadn't finished drinking. The courthouse parking lot in downtown Crestfield was already half full when she arrived at 8:44, and she sat in the driver's seat for a minute with her eyes closed, reminding herself why she was here. Not for herself. For Ethan Briggs. She'd known Ethan for 3 years since he'd come in as a patient. Deep laceration to the forearm, needed 7 stitches. Nothing serious. And they'd ended up talking for 40 minutes while she worked. He'd been a Navy corpsman before his discharge. She'd been something else before she became a nurse. They hadn't compared notes exactly, but there had been a kind of recognition between them, the way 2 people sometimes understand each other without needing the full story. They'd stayed in Lute's contact afterward. He would check in occasionally, she would answer. When he'd called her 2 weeks ago, his voice had been flat in a way that told her he was working very hard not to sound scared. "They're saying I assaulted a man," he said. "I need you to look at something." She'd looked. And what she'd found had made her set aside a full day off, drive 40 minutes to the Crestfield courthouse, and walk into Judge Walter Crane's courtroom in a blood-stained jacket. The courtroom was not large, but it was formal in the way that old government buildings sometimes are. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. There were maybe 30 people in the gallery. The prosecution team sat at the left table. 2 attorneys, polished and well-rested, with the particular ease of people accustomed to winning. Ethan sat at the defense table beside his attorney, a woman named Sandra Coe, who Rachel had been briefly introduced to in the hallway. Ethan looked like he hadn't slept either, but his version of sleeplessness was different. It had edges on it, like he was waiting for something bad and bracing against it. He caught Rachel's eye when she came in. She gave him a small nod. He exhaled slowly. She took a seat in the gallery and waited. The morning session was procedural. Motions were argued. The prosecution laid out its framework. Ethan Briggs had been involved in a confrontation outside the Riverside Grill on the evening of September 14th. A man named Logan Pierce had been taken to the hospital with a fractured orbital socket, a broken nose, and a dislocated shoulder. Witnesses claimed Ethan had thrown the first strike. The defense argued otherwise, but the prosecution's witnesses were consistent, and their story had the weight of repetition behind it. Rachel listened carefully. She had read the incident report twice on her phone while eating vending machine crackers in the courthouse hallway. She had also read the attending physician's notes from Harlow Memorial's emergency department, where, coincidentally, she worked, from the night Logan Pierce was brought in. Those notes were interesting. What they contained, and what they pointedly failed to contain, told a story that the prosecution had not touched. She was called to the stand at 11:15. She walked up, took the oath, and sat down. The defense attorney led her through basic identification first: name, profession, years of experience. "And in your capacity as a trauma nurse," Sandra Coe said, "did you have occasion to review the emergency department records from the night of September 14th? "I did." "What did you find?" Rachel began to explain. She was 3 sentences in when Judge Walter Crane interrupted.
"Hold on." He was looking at her jacket, not at her face, at the patch. "What is that?" Rachel glanced down at the patch, then back up at him. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Your Honor." "That patch. On your jacket." He said it like the words tasted wrong. "Are you wearing a military uniform into my courtroom?" "It's a jacket."
"It's a costume," he said flatly. The word landed hard. Someone in the gallery laughed, a short, sharp sound, and then a few others followed, the way laughter sometimes spreads when someone with authority gives people permission. "You're a nurse, not a soldier. Take it off." Rachel's jaw tightened by maybe 2 millimeters. That was all. "Your Honor, I'd like to continue my testimony." "I'm sure you would. Remove the jacket first." "No, Your Honor." The laughter stopped. Judge Crane looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was not used to hearing that word from witnesses. It was almost curious, that expression, beneath the irritation, like he was trying to figure out if he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" "No," Rachel said again. Not loudly, not defiantly exactly, just clearly. The way she said, "This is going to hurt," to patients before a procedure. Honest, not unkind, and absolutely not a question. Crane straightened in his chair. "Ms. Voss, I will hold you in contempt of this court if you don't remove that jacket in the next 30 seconds. I don't care if it's sentimental. I don't care if your grandfather wore it. This courtroom is not a place for cosplay." More laughter, louder now. One of the prosecution attorneys covered her mouth politely. Ethan stared at the table. Sandra Coe leaned over and said something quietly to him that Rachel couldn't hear. Rachel sat with her hands folded in her lap and waited for the laughter to finish. She did not change her expression. She did not look away from Judge Crane. She simply waited, the way she waited for a patient's vitals to stabilize, without urgency, without apology, with the particular stillness of someone who has been in rooms where the stakes were very different and still managed to stay calm. 30 seconds, Crane repeated. "I heard you the first time," she said. That landed differently than anything else she'd said. The gallery went quiet in a new way. Not the laughter stopping quiet from before, but something tighter. Sandra Coe put her pen down. One of the prosecution attorneys looked up from his notes. Crane's face shifted. The curiosity was gone. "That's contempt, Ms. Voss. You'll—" The courtroom door opened. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. The man who walked in was in his 60s, silver-haired, wearing civilian clothes, dark trousers, a plain gray jacket, but he moved through the space with an economy of motion that was hard to ignore. He wasn't large. He wasn't loud. He simply walked to the side of the room and stopped. And somehow his presence rearranged the room around him the way a stone dropped in water rearranges the surface. His name, Rachel would later learn, was Colonel Dale Whitmore, retired, formerly of the United States Special Operations Command. He had been in the building for an unrelated matter. He had heard voices from the hallway. Specifically, he had heard the word costume used in a particular context. And he had pushed open the door and looked at the woman on the witness stand. He had gone very still. He stood against the wall and said nothing, but his eyes were fixed on Rachel's jacket with an expression that the bailiff near him would later describe, to anyone who asked, as a man who had just seen something he thought he'd never see again. Crane, distracted by the door, looked over. "Sir, are you—" "Apologies," Whitmore said. "Continue." Crane turned back to Rachel. "You are in contempt of this court. I'm ordering you removed from the stand and—" "Your Honor?" It was Sandra Coe, on her feet. "Before you remove my witness, I'd ask the court to take one moment. Your witness is refusing a direct order. She is, Coe said, and I think you might want to understand why before you make that order a matter of record. Crane looked at her, then at Rachel, then at the man standing against the wall, who had not moved and was still watching Rachel with that same strange expression. The judge made a sound in the back of his throat. You have 60 seconds, counselor. Coe nodded. She looked at Rachel. Ms. Voss, will you tell the court what the patch on your jacket represents? Rachel looked at her attorney for a moment. Then she looked at Crane. Then, slowly, she stood up. She reached for the zipper of her jacket and pulled it down. She had not intended to do this. She had planned to hold her ground, accept the contempt charge if it came to that, and deal with the consequences afterward, because the consequences of Ethan Briggs going to prison were worse than any contempt charge she'd face. But something about the way that man against the wall was looking at her, not with pity, not with amusement, but with a recognition so complete it almost felt like being called by a name you hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, made her stop calculating and just move. She took the jacket off. The courtroom inhaled. Her arms were bare below the rolled sleeves of her scrub top, and what was on them was not subtle. Burns covered the outer surface of her right forearm from wrist to elbow. Old burns, healed and grafted, the skin pale and slightly glossy where the grafts had taken. On her left arm, 2 long, thin scars ran parallel across the bicep, clean-edged in a way that did not suggest an accident. Beneath the short sleeve of her scrub top, the edge of a shrapnel scar was visible at her left shoulder, crater-shaped, roughly 2 inches across, the surrounding tissue slightly puckered. Nobody laughed. Judge Crane's expression had changed in a way that would have been difficult to describe precisely. He was looking at her arms the way people sometimes look at things they weren't prepared to see. Rachel folded the jacket over her arm and sat back down. From the wall, Colonel Whitmore took 3 steps forward into the room. He stopped, squared his shoulders, and brought his right hand to his brow in a salute, crisp, formal, the kind that meant something. I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor. His voice was quiet and even. But I want the record to reflect that that patch belongs to a classified special operations unit. I'm not authorized to say its designation in open court, but I can tell you that the individuals who earned it did not earn it easily. He paused. And I can tell you that calling it a costume is an error I would strongly recommend correcting. The courtroom was completely silent. Crane looked at Whitmore. He looked at Rachel. He looked at the jacket folded across her arm, the patch facing outward, black and olive, the insignia precise and worn with age. He opened his mouth, closed it. He reached for his water glass, didn't drink from it. He cleared his throat. We'll take a 15-minute recess. He stood and left the room faster than judges usually moved. Rachel sat on the witness stand while the courtroom buzzed around her. Quiet, urgent conversations. People looking at her and then looking away when she noticed. Sandra Coe approached and leaned in close. Are you okay? I'm fine. Rachel looked toward the defense table. Ethan was watching her. His face was doing something complicated, gratitude, and something that looked like grief because he understood, probably better than anyone else in the room, exactly what it costs to show someone else your damage just to prove a point. Can we move forward when he comes back? I need to get through the testimony. Yes, Coe said. Yes, absolutely. Whitmore approached the stand carefully, like he wasn't sure he was welcome. Phantom 7, he said quietly. Not a question. Rachel looked at him. That's not my name anymore, Colonel. No, he agreed. But it was once. He paused. The unit was formally decommissioned 4 years ago. The remaining personnel files are still sealed. He said this carefully, deliberately, like he was choosing each word by hand. Which means most people in this room have no way of verifying anything you've done, which also means they can say whatever they want about you without consequence. Rachel looked at him steadily. I know. Are you planning to let them? I'm planning to get an innocent man out of this courtroom, she said. That's the only thing I'm here for. Whitmore nodded once. He stepped back. He took a seat in the gallery, 4th row, end of the aisle, and he did not leave. When Judge Crane returned from his recess, he was quieter. The smirk was gone. He settled into his chair with the careful movements of a man recalibrating his understanding of the situation, and when he looked at Rachel Voss on the witness stand, he looked at her differently. Not with warmth, Crane was not a warm man, but with the particular caution people develop when they realize they've made an assumption that turned out to be expensive. "We'll resume," he said. "Miss Voss, you may continue your testimony." Sandra Coe stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Voss, can you describe your findings when you reviewed the emergency department records from September 14th? Rachel set her jacket on the rail beside her and turned to face the room. The burns on her arms were visible. She didn't cover them. She didn't call attention to them either. They were simply there, the way all true things eventually are, present, regardless of whether anyone is ready to acknowledge them. The attending physician's notes from September 14th document Logan Pierce's injuries as consistent with blunt force impact, she said. Fractured orbital socket, nasal fracture, dislocated right shoulder. The prosecution has characterized these injuries as evidence of an unprovoked assault by the defendant. She paused. But there are two things the notes also document that nobody has discussed in this courtroom. The prosecution attorney at the left table shifted in his seat. His name was Daniel Firth, and he had the kind of confidence that came from winning enough cases that he'd stopped expecting surprises. He was starting to look slightly less comfortable. First, Rachel continued, Logan Pierce's blood alcohol content at time of admission was 0.17. That's more than twice the legal driving limit. It was documented in his intake assessment and not referenced at any point in the prosecution's evidence summary. She looked at Firth. That level of intoxication affects coordination, judgment, aggression thresholds, and the reliability of a witness's own account of events. Significantly. Firth was on his feet. Objection. The witness is offering medical opinion without being qualified as, "I have 17 years of emergency nursing experience," Rachel said, before the judge could rule, including 3 years of combat trauma care in environments where understanding the physiological effects of intoxication was not optional. "I'll defer to whatever standard the court requires, but I don't think the numbers are in dispute." Crane looked at Firth. Firth sat down. "Continue," Crane said, and the word was slightly flatter than it had been an hour ago. "Second," Rachel said, "the triage notes from 11:47 p.m. that same night document a separate patient admitted through the same emergency department, approximately 90 minutes before Logan Pierce's arrival. The patient is listed by initials only, standard protocol for a victim requesting confidentiality. She was a 24-year-old female, presenting with facial contusions, a lacerated lower lip, and bruising consistent with a grab injury across both wrists." Rachel let that sit for a moment in the room's air. She was not admitted in connection with any criminal case. No police report was taken. No follow-up was logged in the system as of the date I reviewed the records. The courtroom had gone very quiet. "The timing of her admission," Rachel said, "places her in the Riverside Grill area approximately 30 minutes before the incident involving Mr. Briggs, and the physical profile of her injuries is consistent with an assault." Sandra Coe said, "Are you suggesting a connection between this unidentified patient and the defendant's case?" "I'm saying the emergency department documented an assault victim who was never followed up with by law enforcement at the same location within the same time window, involving at least one individual who was present at the Riverside Grill that night." Rachel looked at the jury box. "I'm saying that if someone had followed up, we might have a very different picture of what actually happened and why Ethan Briggs did what he did." Ethan's eyes were fixed on the table. His hands were flat on the surface in front of him, and the tendons in his forearms were visible. He was holding very still. "Do you know who the unidentified patient is?" Coe asked. "I have a name," Rachel said. Firth was on his feet again. "Objection. Patient confidentiality." "The patient in question," Rachel said clearly, "has subsequently come forward. She contacted the hospital 2 days ago and indicated she was willing to have her records referenced in this proceeding." She looked at Crane. "I have a signed release, Your Honor, if the court needs it entered." Crane looked at Firth. Firth looked at his co-counsel. A long silence moved through the room. "Your Honor," Firth said finally, and something in his voice had shifted, not defeated, not yet, but recalibrating the same way Crane had during the recess. "I'd request a short continuance to—" "No," Crane said. One word, short and sharp. Firth blinked. "Your Honor, this court has already taken one recess today." Crane's voice had an edge in it now that wasn't directed at Rachel. "The witness will continue." Rachel reached into the folder she'd carried to the stand and removed a single sheet of paper. the signed release, as she'd said. She handed it to the bailiff. While the bailiff moved it to the judge, she looked out at the gallery. Colonel Whitmore sat in the fourth row with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes steady on the proceedings. He caught her look. He didn't nod or gesture, just held the look for a moment and then redirected his gaze to the bench with the patience of a man who was very good at waiting. Rachel turned back to the courtroom. "The patient's name," she said, "is Tessa Granville. She was a waitress at the Riverside Grill on the evening of September 14th. She was assaulted in the back corridor of the restaurant near the service exit at approximately 11 p.m. The man who assaulted her was Logan Pierce." She paused. Ethan Briggs witnessed it. He intervened, and Logan Pierce redirected his aggression. The silence in the courtroom was the kind that happened when a room full of people was processing something they hadn't been prepared for, not stunned exactly, but deeply recalculating. Ethan looked up from the table for the first time since she'd begun this part of her testimony. His eyes were bright and slightly wet, and he pressed his lips together and looked away. Firth had stopped standing up. He was leaning toward his co-counsel, speaking quickly and quietly. His co-counsel was looking at her phone under the table with the expression of someone receiving information they didn't want. "Miss Voss," Co said carefully, "why wasn't this information surfaced earlier? In the police report or the initial investigation?" Rachel looked at the jury. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly the right question." She reached into her folder again. "Because the police report from that evening was completed by Officer Dennis Hartwell of the Crestfield PD. Officer Hartwell, 3 weeks before September 14th, attended a fundraising event hosted by the Pierce Family Foundation. The foundation, which I have documentation of here, is a charitable arm of Pierce Property Group, a commercial real estate development company whose principal is Richard Pierce." She set the documents on the rail beside her. "Logan Pierce's father." The room broke into noise. Not chaos, but the sound of people whispering urgently to each other, heads turning, the prosecution table suddenly very busy with documents being shuffled and phones quietly retrieved. Judge Crane raised a hand for order, and the room pulled back into silence. Crane looked at the documents on the rail. He looked at Rachel. He had the expression of a man who had started the morning expecting a routine testimony from a nurse in a second-hand jacket, and was now sitting in the center of something considerably larger, and was aware enough to understand that his next few decisions mattered. "Counselor Coe," he said slowly, "how many more items does your witness have?" "Several, Your Honor." Crane nodded once. He looked at Firth. "Mr. Firth, you'll have your opportunity to cross-examine. That opportunity is not going anywhere." He looked back at Rachel. "Ms. Voss, continue." Rachel took a breath. Not for composure. She was composed. For clarity. Because what came next was the part that mattered most, and she'd been waiting since 3:47 a.m. for this moment, through Marcus and his collapsed lung and his missing mother, and the vending machine crackers and the cold drive down the mountain, and the laughter in this courtroom that nobody was laughing anymore. "The emergency department records," she said, "were accessed and printed on September 17th, 3 days after the incident. The access log shows they were pulled under a physician login that did not match the attending who treated either patient. That login belongs to a Dr. Howard Sims." She looked at Crane. "Dr. Sims has not been employed at Harlow Memorial Hospital since 2021. His credentials were not deactivated. They were used to access protected patient records, print them, and based on a subsequent audit of the document management system, selectively delete 2 attachments from Tessa Granville's file." The courtroom was absolutely quiet. "Those attachments," Rachel continued, "were photographs. Standard documentation of visible injuries. They are gone from the system. But Tessa Granville's treating nurse took additional photographs on her personal phone as a precaution, a practice some emergency nurses use when they're concerned a patient may not follow up. And Tessa still has them." From the defense table, Ethan Briggs put his hands over his face. From the prosecution table, Daniel Firth stood up. Not to object, not to interrupt, but with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who needed a moment to stand upright and figure out what he was standing in. "Your Honor," Firth said, and his voice had lost its earlier polish. It was not quite steady. "I would like to request a continuance." Judge Walter Crane looked at Daniel Firth for a long moment. Then he looked at Rachel Voss. sitting straight-backed on the witness stand with her burned arms uncovered and a folder of documents on the rail beside her, and the expression of someone who had been awake for 23 hours and was nowhere near finished. Then he looked at Colonel Whitmore in the fourth row, who was watching the bench with quiet, complete attention, as though he'd seen things like this before. Not this exactly, but the shape of it, the moment when truth became undeniable, and the only remaining question was whether the people in power would move toward it or away. Crane turned back to Firth. "Denied," he said. And somewhere in the back of the gallery, someone let out a breath they had been holding for a very long time. And somewhere in the back of the gallery, someone let out a breath they had been holding for a very long time. The sound that followed was not applause, not gasping. It was the sound of a room full of people recalculating simultaneously. 30-something individuals shifting in their seats, rustling papers, exchanging glances that carried whole conversations in them. Daniel Firth sat back down with the careful movements of a man trying not to let his body language say what his face was already saying. His co-counsel, a younger woman named Priya Moss, had stopped looking at her phone and was now staring straight ahead at the middle distance with an expression Rachel recognized from the trauma bay. The look of someone who had just received information that fundamentally changed the situation and was sorting through what that meant. Judge Crane shuffled the documents on his bench. He was not a man who showed much, but the set of his jaw had changed since the morning session, and the way he was holding himself, more upright, more deliberate, suggested that whatever comfortable certainty he'd walked in with had been quietly replaced by something else. "Ms. Voss," he said, "you mentioned a document access log. How did you obtain that?" "I submitted a formal records request to Harlow Memorial's compliance office 8 days ago," Rachel said. "I cited a concern about the integrity of records related to an active legal proceeding. The compliance team is required by hospital policy to investigate and provide a response within 5 business days. I received the access log on day 4. And the hospital's administration is aware you're using this in testimony today?" "The compliance director was copied on my notification to defense counsel," Rachel said. "Yes." Crane considered that. Then he looked at Firth. "You were notified of this evidence?" Firth's voice was careful. "We received notification of new evidence being submitted, Your Honor. The full contents were not—" "Were you notified, Mr. Firth?" A pause. "Yes, Your Honor." Crane set his pen down. He did not say anything for a moment. The courtroom held very still. "We'll continue," Crane said finally. "Ms. Coe, how much more does your witness have to cover?" Sandra Coe stood. "Approximately 20 minutes of substantive testimony, Your Honor, and then we have 2 additional witnesses waiting." "Additional witnesses?" Crane repeated this without particular inflection, but his eyes moved briefly to the prosecution table. "Are these witnesses part of the materials submitted to opposing counsel?" "They are, Your Honor. Both were included in the supplemental disclosure filed Monday." Firth was on his feet again, but more slowly this time. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to note our objection to the late—" "Your objection is noted, Mr. Firth." Crane's tone had taken on a particular texture, not hostile, but dense, the way a door sounds when it's shut firmly rather than slammed. "Sit down." Firth sat. Rachel kept her eyes on the jury. There were 8 of them. The case had proceeded with a reduced panel, and their faces told different stories. A heavy-set man in the front row, construction calluses on his hands, was leaning slightly forward in his chair. A woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead had her arms crossed, but not in the way that meant resistance, in the way that meant she was thinking very hard. A young man at the end of the second row had his jaw set. He'd been watching Rachel since she sat down, and his expression had moved over the course of the last hour, from neutral through skeptical, and arrived somewhere that looked like controlled anger. Not at her. At something else. "I want to return to Tessa Granville," Rachel said, "before we move to the records issue." Coe nodded. "Please." Tessa came to the emergency department at 11:47 p.m. She was triaged by the charge nurse and assessed by the attending. Her injuries were documented. She was given a patient advocate contact and asked if she wanted police called. She said no. Rachel paused. That's her right. In that moment, that was her choice, and it was respected. What is not within her rights, or anyone else's, is that her medical record was subsequently accessed without clinical cause, and photographs documenting the injuries she chose to have recorded were deleted. Who deleted them? Ko asked. The access log shows the deletion occurring under the same Dr. Sims credentials during the same session on September 17th. Rachel picked up another sheet from her folder. The session lasted 11 minutes. In that 11 minutes, someone accessed Tessa Granville's record, printed portions of it, deleted 2 image attachments, and logged out. The IP address associated with that session does not correspond to any terminal within the hospital building. The jury foreman, the man with the construction calluses, was no longer leaning forward. He was sitting with his elbows on the rail, hands folded, looking at Rachel with the focused attention of someone who was no longer waiting to decide what he thought. External access, Ko said. Yes, remote login, which is possible if you have valid credentials and know the system architecture. Rachel set the paper down. Harlow Memorial uses a third-party document management platform. The platform vendor confirmed in writing that the Sims credentials were used via remote access and that the deletion was deliberate, not a system error. From the back of the gallery, a door opened quietly. Rachel glanced up from habit, the way she did in the trauma bay when someone came in fast. 2 men in dark suits had entered, positioned themselves along the back wall, and stood with their hands clasped in front of them in the way that certain professionals learn to stand when they want to be present without being noticed. They were not courthouse security. The courthouse security personnel were in uniform. These men were not. Colonel Whitmore, from his position in the 4th row, turned his head slightly to assess them. Whatever he concluded, he kept it to himself and turned back to face the front. Rachel continued. The vendor also confirmed that a request was submitted, using a different internal email account, to have the deletion classified as routine system maintenance in the platform's audit trail. That request was flagged by the vendor's compliance team as irregular and was not processed. She paused. But it was made. When was that request made? Ko asked. September 18th, the day after the deletion. The young man at the end of the jury's 2nd row made a sound, barely audible, more breath than voice, and pressed his thumb hard against his lower lip. Firth rose. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is characterizing a routine administrative request as evidence of intent without adequate. The vendor's compliance team flagged it as irregular, Rachel said, before Crane could respond. That's their characterization, not mine. I'm reading from their written report. Crane looked at Firth. Overruled. The document speaks for itself. He gestured for Rachel to continue. She was tired. The kind of tired that settled into the body differently than ordinary fatigue. It lived in her lower back and in the backs of her eyes, and it made the edges of things slightly imprecise. She'd been in worse shape during worse situations and produced functioning work, so the tiredness was simply something she noted and set aside. The same way you noted and set aside discomfort in a long procedure when stopping wasn't an option. The final item, she said. There were 3 witness statements collected by Officer Hartwell on the night of September 14th that place Ethan Briggs as the aggressor. All 3 are patrons who were outside the Riverside Grill when the confrontation occurred. She removed a stapled sheaf of papers. I obtained the credit card transaction records for the restaurant that evening. Ko tilted her head. How? 2 of the 3 witnesses listed in Hartwell's report were not in the restaurant system as customers that evening. No transaction, no reservation, no record of their presence. She set the papers on the rail. They were not there. Or if they were, they left no trace. The courtroom broke into sound again, more sustained this time, a wave of voices that Crane let run for 3 full seconds before bringing his gavel down. Order. 2 strikes. The noise subsided. Ms. Voss, the credit card records, how did you access those? Defense counsel submitted a subpoena for the restaurant's transaction records 9 days ago, Ko interjected, on her feet. The records were produced by the restaurant's parent company in compliance with the subpoena. Ms. Voss analyzed them at my request. Firth's co-counsel, Priya Moss, was writing rapidly on a legal pad. Her handwriting had lost its earlier precision. The 3rd witness, Rachel continued, does appear in the system. He made a transaction at 10:22 p.m., more than 30 minutes before the incident occurred outside. His statement places him at the scene at 11:08 p.m. His receipt places him leaving the building at 10:24. She let that sit. Either he returned to the area, which is possible, or his account of when and what he witnessed is inaccurate. She closed her folder. I'm done, she said, and looked at Ko. Ko said, No further questions, Your Honor. The cross-examination that followed was conducted by Priya Moss rather than Firth, which itself said something. Moss was sharper than her earlier silence had suggested. She came at the access log from an evidentiary angle, questioned the chain of custody on the vendor compliance report, and pushed on Rachel's qualifications to interpret medical records in a legal context. Rachel answered each question without ornament. She didn't over-explain. She didn't walk into any of the linguistic traps that Moss laid, with the particular care of someone trying to salvage a situation rather than win an argument. At one point, Moss said, "Ms. Voss, you have a significant personal relationship with the defendant, don't you?" "We're acquaintances," Rachel said. "You testified on his behalf voluntarily, no subpoena." "Yes." "So your testimony is motivated, at least in part, by loyalty." Rachel looked at her. "My testimony is motivated by what's in the records. The records exist regardless of how I feel about Ethan Briggs." "But you chose to look at those records because of your relationship with him." "I looked at those records," Rachel said, "because he told me something was wrong. I looked because that's what you do when someone tells you something is wrong and you have the means to find out whether they're right." She paused. "I found out he was right. What I found exists independently of why I looked." Moss moved on. She spent another 12 minutes on the technical aspects of the document access log and achieved, in Rachel's estimation, a moderate amount of damage, enough to give the jury something to weigh, not enough to dislodge the core of what had been established. When she finally said no further questions, she sat down without looking at Firth. Rachel stepped down from the stand. She walked back through the bar, past the defense table, and took a seat in the gallery. Ethan turned briefly to look at her. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. She just gave him the same small nod she'd given him when she walked in, and something in his face shifted. Not relief yet, because relief was still a long way off and they both knew it, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like being held up by another person when your own legs are not entirely reliable. The next witness was a woman named Dr. Carolyn Sutter, a forensic document examiner who had reviewed the physical police report from September 14th and identified two sections where the original ink composition differed from the surrounding text. Consistent, she testified, with content being added after the initial document was completed. The alterations appeared in the section describing witness accounts of the incident's initiation. Firth's cross-examination of Sutter was more aggressive and technically sophisticated, and it partially succeeded. He elicited her acknowledgement that the difference in ink composition could result from using a different pen at the same sitting rather than a later edition. Sutter held her ground on the statistical probability, but Firth had introduced enough ambiguity that the alteration evidence was weakened, not destroyed. Weakened. Rachel watched from the gallery and made a note in the margin of her legal pad. She was not an attorney. The note was not for anyone else. She wrote, "Hartwell still exposed REIT fundraiser/transaction records unchanged, /Sims credentials uncontested. The three pillars were still standing." The second additional witness was a man named Terrence Galt, a former employee of Pierce Property Group's facilities division, who had been let go 8 months ago and had contacted Sandra Coe's office 2 weeks prior. Galt was nervous. He held his water glass with both hands, and his voice started too high and settled lower as he got through the first few questions. But he was specific. He testified that in October, 6 weeks after the Riverside Grill incident, he had overheard a conversation between Richard Pierce and the company's in-house counsel discussing the Briggs matter and what he described as making sure the story stayed clean. He had not been asked to do anything directly. He had heard what he heard. Firth destroyed Galt on cross with efficient brutality. Former employee with a grievance, no direct instruction given, no corroboration, second-hand interpretation of a casual phrase. By the time Firth finished, Galt looked smaller than when he'd sat down, and the jury's body language had pulled back slightly. Rachel wrote nothing in the margin this time. Galt's testimony had been a risk from the start. She'd told Coe as much. A single witness with motive and no documentation was a gamble, and the gamble hadn't fully paid. But it had done one thing. It had put Richard Pierce's name into this courtroom in connection with the words, "the Briggs matter." Whatever Firth had done to Galt's credibility, he couldn't unring that particular bell. The afternoon session broke at 3:40 p.m. Rachel walked out into the courthouse hallway and stood near a window that overlooked the parking lot, and for a moment she simply breathed. The hallway was full of people moving around her. attorneys, clerks, a few observers spilling from other courtrooms, and she let the noise wash past her without engaging any of it. Her lower back was a sustained complaint. Her eyes were burning. She needed food that wasn't from a vending machine. Voss. She turned. Colonel Whitmore was walking toward her, moving at the unhurried pace he used for everything, which somehow covered ground efficiently anyway. Colonel? He stopped beside her and looked out the same window. In the parking lot below, a dark SUV sat across 3 spaces with its engine running. How are you? He asked. Tired. He looked at the SUV. You know who that is? Someone from the Pierce side, I'd guess. Richard Pierce's assistant drove in from Brenton this morning, Whitmore said. I recognize the plates. They've had someone in the gallery all day. Rachel looked at the SUV. Okay, that doesn't concern you. It concerns me enough, she said. I'm not going to let it change what I do. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. I knew an officer, he said, years ago. Classified operation, so I can't be specific. He had a gift, the ability to stay completely functional under sustained pressure, not just physically, cognitively. You'd ask him to solve a problem, and he'd solve it the same whether he'd been awake for 4 hours or 40. He paused. I see the same thing in you. Rachel looked at him. I make mistakes when I'm tired. Everyone does. The mistakes I make when I'm tired cost more than most people's mistakes when they're tired. He accepted that without argument. The attorney, she's good. She's very good. But she's going to need more, he said. What you put in front of the jury today was enough to create doubt. It's not enough to break this open. Firth is going to rebuild tonight, and he's going to come in tomorrow with a response to everything you laid down. Rachel turned from the window. I know. Do you have more? She looked at him for a moment, not evasively, just measuring. Some, she said. What kind of some? The kind that isn't fully developed yet. The access log established that someone deleted Tessa's photographs. It doesn't establish who was sitting at the keyboard. The IP address traces to a residential service area in Brenton, which is where the Pierce family's primary property is located, but that's not the same as a specific address. She paused. We submitted a formal request to the service provider for more specific routing information. We've been waiting on it. When did you submit the request? 5 days ago. Whitmore looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not alarm, but assessment, the kind of rapid evaluation Rachel associated with people who had spent time making fast decisions in conditions where the information was never complete. 5 days, he said. Who signed the request? Coe's office. He was quiet. A civil subpoena for ISP records takes 3 to 6 weeks, he said. Minimum. With a cooperative provider, sometimes 2. Rachel knew this. She'd known it when she filed the request. We asked for voluntary compliance on an expedited basis. And the provider's response? She didn't answer. Whitmore read the silence. They haven't responded. Not yet. Firth's going to bury the IP address angle tomorrow on the grounds that it's insufficient to support any specific attribution. He wasn't saying this to pressure her. He was saying it the way good field personnel said hard things, as a factual assessment of the terrain, not a judgment. He's going to use it to reframe the entire access log as circumstantial. I know, she said again. So what do you need? She looked back at the window. The SUV in the parking lot had moved. It was pulling out now, slow and deliberate, heading toward the exit. I need the ISP to respond, she said. Or I need something else that removes the ambiguity. She exhaled. Or I need Tessa Granville to walk into that courtroom tomorrow and sit on that stand, and I need her to be okay. The last part came out quieter than the rest. Whitmore looked at her with the particular attention people paid when they heard something that wasn't quite the clinical summary that preceded it. Is she not okay? Rachel stopped, started again. She's been through something significant. Assault, then intimidation into silence, then watching the person who hurt her become a victim in the public record while she stayed invisible. She paused. She contacted the hospital 2 days ago and said she'd cooperate, but 2 days ago is not the same as tomorrow morning, and I have no control over whether she walks through that door. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Where is she now? I don't know exactly.
She's been staying with family outside the city. Rachel looked at him. Why? Because I know some people, he said carefully, who are very good at ensuring individuals feel safe enough to do difficult things. Not coercion, not pressure, just presence, protection, logistical support. You mean military? I mean people who take promises seriously.
Rachel considered him. She was tired enough that the consideration was slower than usual, moving through more friction. If she comes tomorrow, she said finally, it needs to be her choice, all the way. If she feels like she was marshaled into it, her testimony loses everything that makes it valuable. I understand that. Do the people you know understand that? Yes, he said simply. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back toward the courtroom doors. Inside, the gallery had mostly emptied. Through the small rectangle of glass in one door, she could see the prosecution table where Firth and Moss were still seated. 2 paralegal staff gathered around them, documents spread in a wide organized pattern. They were already working. Okay, she said. Yes. Whitmore nodded once. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card, plain white, just a phone number, and handed it to her. Call me by 7. If I haven't heard from you, I'll assume tomorrow's plan holds. He walked away the same way he'd entered the courtroom, without announcing himself, without theater, just moving steadily toward the next thing. Rachel put the card in her pocket and went to find Sandra Coe. They worked until nearly midnight in Coe's office, which was on the 4th floor of a building 4 blocks from the courthouse and smelled of old coffee and the particular dry warmth of paper in a closed room. The office had 2 large windows that looked out over a street where a late-night convenience store cast a yellow rectangle of light on the sidewalk. Rachel sat across from Coe at the conference table with her jacket back on and a cup of gas station coffee she'd picked up on the way over going cold at her elbow. Coe was younger than Rachel had initially assessed, early 40s maybe, but she carried herself like someone who had been doing the work long enough that the age showed more incompetence than in years. She was precise without being mechanical, and she had the thing that distinguished genuinely good attorneys from merely confident ones. She knew exactly where her case was weak, and she looked directly at those weaknesses instead of around them. The IP address is our biggest exposure, Coe said. She had her hair pulled back and a second pair of glasses on, reading glasses, wire-framed, which gave her a slightly different aspect than the courtroom version. Firth is going to stand up tomorrow morning and tell that jury that we've proven someone accessed a system, but we haven't proven who. And he's right. We've proven the access is connected to a residential area where the Pierce property is located, Rachel said. That's a zip code, Coe said. Roughly 40,000 residents, plus Sims credentials, plus the fundraiser connection, plus the credit card discrepancies. Each of which is individually deniable. Coe pulled a legal pad toward her. Together they're compelling, but Firth is good, and he's going to argue that we've constructed a theory and reverse-engineered evidence to support it, rather than followed evidence to a conclusion. Has the ISP said anything? I called them this afternoon after court. Their compliance team is looking at the request. Coe paused. That's what they said. Which means they haven't moved. Which means they haven't moved. Rachel was quiet. Outside the window, a car passed with its radio on, something with bass that softened as the car moved down the street and faded to nothing. The convenience store sign buzzed faintly. Tessa, Rachel said. I know. If she comes tomorrow, if she comes and she's solid, it changes the geometry of the whole thing. It stops being a theory about records and starts being a person, a specific person who was hurt, whose record was tampered with, who was kept silent. She paused. Firth can attack records. He can't attack Tessa without making himself look like he's doing exactly what the Pierces did. Coe looked at her reading glasses. I'm not willing to pressure her. I know, I told Whitmore the same thing. Coe looked up. What did Whitmore say? He said he knows people who can make her feel safe enough to decide. Rachel met her eyes. I think he meant it the way he said it. Coe was quiet for a moment. Do you trust him? Rachel thought about the man in the gallery, sitting with his hands folded, watching the proceedings without any of the agitated investment she'd seen in every other person in that room. Watching with the particular steadiness of someone who had learned, through years of unpredictable outcomes, to care about justice without being destroyed when it moved slowly. Yes, she said. Enough. They went back to work. Rachel walked Coe through the forensic structure of the access log 3 more times until Coe could dismantle Firth's likely counterarguments from 3 different angles without needing notes. They prepared redirect questions in case Firth's cross-examination of Rachel's testimony, which he would be allowed to pursue the next morning if he requested time, tried to reframe the compliance report. They identified 2 backup lines of questioning if Tessa didn't appear. At 11:47 p.m., Coe's phone rang. She looked at the screen, answered it, said nothing for nearly 40 seconds except, "Okay," twice. Then she hung up and looked at Rachel. "That was my investigator," she said. "He's been sitting outside the Pierce's main property in Brenton since this afternoon." Rachel straightened. "Richard Pierce had 2 visitors tonight," Coe said. "Arrived separately. One of them was Officer Dennis Hartwell." She paused. "The other one was Daniel Firth." The room was very quiet for a moment. "Hartwell and Firth." Rachel's voice was careful. "At the Pierce property." At 11 p.m., the night before testimony resumes. Coe's voice was flat in a way that Rachel understood was not actually flatness, but the controlled version of something considerably less calm. "My investigator has photographs." Rachel looked at her. "This," Coe said slowly, "is either completely innocuous or it is the worst decision a prosecuting attorney has ever made in the state of Colorado." Rachel pulled her jacket tighter. The burn scars on her right forearm caught the light from the overhead, pale and defined. "Firth knew about Hartwell," she said. "The fundraiser connection. He's had that since our disclosure on Monday." "He's had it and said nothing." "He's had it and met privately with the man it concerns, the night before we go back on record." Rachel looked at Coe. "Does your investigator have a clear identification on both?" "He says yes. He's sending the photographs now." Coe's phone buzzed. She opened the images. She looked at them for a long time. Then she turned the phone and showed Rachel. The photographs were taken from a distance, through a long lens, slightly grainy in the low light of the Pierce property's exterior. But they were clear enough. 2 men standing at the front door caught mid-conversation. One of them was the officer whose name had been on the police report that started all of this. The other was the man who had stood in a courtroom that morning and called Rachel's evidence a theory reverse-engineered to fit a conclusion. Rachel looked at the photographs for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she said, "You need to call the state bar." "I know," Coe said quietly. "Tonight." "I know." Coe was already picking up her phone. "Rachel." She said it in a way that made Rachel pause before standing up. "The Pierces are going to know we have this by morning. Whatever they're planning for tomorrow, Firth's counter strategy, whatever they think they have, it changes the moment I make this call." "Yes. Which means whatever they're capable of doing in response, they'll do it tonight." Rachel met her eyes. "I know. Are you going home tonight?" Rachel thought of her apartment, the parking garage, the elevator, the long hallway to her door. She thought of Tessa Granville, somewhere outside the city, staying with family, who'd made a phone call 2 days ago and said she'd cooperate. She thought of what Whitmore had said about people who take promises seriously. "I'll be fine," she said. But she took out her phone before she left the building, and she sent Whitmore a single text message that said, "Tonight might move faster than expected. However many people you have, now would be good." She was in her car, engine running, watching the street ahead of her, when his reply came back in under a minute. "Already in position. Drive carefully." Rachel put the car in gear. The street was empty and the city was quiet, and somewhere across the distance between Crestfield and Brenton, a man named Richard Pierce had just received a phone call that Rachel couldn't hear but could perfectly imagine. Fast, low, urgent. The voice on the other end saying something that made him stand up from wherever he was sitting and start making calls of his own. She had 2 traffic lights between the office and the interstate, and she was waiting at the first one when her phone rang through the car speakers with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. The voice was young, female, unsteady, speaking fast. "Is this Rachel Voss, the nurse from Harlow Memorial?" Rachel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Yes." "This is Tessa Granville," the voice said. I need to tell you something about tonight." A breath. "Someone came to my sister's house an hour ago. They didn't knock, they just stood outside. And my sister's kid saw them through the window, and..." Her voice broke slightly and she pulled it back together. I need to know if it's safe. I need to know if I come tomorrow, if you can tell me it's actually safe. The traffic light turned green. Rachel drove through it without moving her eyes from the road ahead, and she took one breath and she said, Tessa, listen to me. I need you to stay inside and keep the lights off and tell me your sister's address. Tessa, listen to me. I need you to stay inside and keep the lights off and tell me your sister's address. Tessa gave it in pieces. Street name, then the number, then the city, her voice dropping lower with each part like she was afraid of being overheard through a closed window. Rachel repeated it back, confirmed it, and told her to stay on the line. Then she picked up her second phone, the one she kept in the center console for work, hospital calls, the administrative layer of her life, and dialed Whitmore. He answered on the second ring. Briar Ridge Road, she said, 1412, Millhaven. There's someone outside the house. How long ago? Tessa says about an hour. Description? She doesn't have one. Her nephew saw them through a window, one person standing near the tree line at the edge of the property. Rachel kept her eyes on the road, both hands on the wheel, the interstate ahead of her empty and dark. Could be nothing. It's not nothing. No, Whitmore said. It's not. A pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds. She could hear him moving, something in the background shifting. We have a 2-person team in Millhaven, 17 minutes out. Okay. Tell her to stay low, stay quiet, and don't open the door for anyone who doesn't say the word Clearwater first. Rachel relayed this to Tessa on the other phone. Tessa repeated it back. Clearwater. In the thin voice of someone doing exactly what they're told because they've run out of other options. Rachel knew that voice. She'd heard it in the field, in the trauma bay, in the dark corners of situations where people were holding on by the last available handhold. It was not weakness. It was the sound of someone who had decided to trust and understood the cost of that decision and was doing it anyway. I'm going to stay on the line with you, Rachel told her. Don't hang up. Okay. A breath. Are you coming here? Rachel looked at the interstate signs. Millhaven was 38 miles east. She was currently heading south toward her apartment. She calculated this in the time it took to pass a truck in the left lane. Yes, she said. I'm coming. She took the next exit and turned around. The drive to Millhaven took 42 minutes because she hit construction outside the Crestfield limits and sat for 11 of them watching a flagman redirect 2 lanes of late-night traffic through a single corridor, with the particular grinding patience of someone who understood that losing her composure in a construction zone would not accelerate anything. She stayed on the phone with Tessa for the first 20 minutes, until the 2-person team Whitmore had sent arrived, and a man's steady voice came through the line saying Clearwater, and Tessa made a sound that was mostly breath and said the door was open. Rachel let Tessa hang up after that. The rest of the drive she spent thinking, which was not the same as worrying. It was specific, structured, following the architecture of the problem the way she followed a patient's anatomy when she was looking for a bleed. The Pierce side knew the photographs existed, or they would by morning when Coe made the call to the state bar. Firth knew. And if Firth knew that Coe knew about the meeting, he also knew his position as prosecuting attorney was compromised in ways that could not be quietly managed. That level of exposure, in Rachel's experience, did one of 2 things to people. It made them retreat, or it made them accelerate. The person standing outside Tessa Granville's sister's house was not a retreat. She pulled off the main road onto Briar Ridge at 1:23 a.m. The houses on either side were dark. The road unpaved beyond the first quarter mile. Gravel that popped under her tires. At 1412, a modest ranch house sat behind a short fence line with 2 vehicles parked in the drive and a light on in the back room. Near the mailbox, one of Whitmore's people stood at the edge of the property, a woman in dark civilian clothing, hands relaxed at her sides, positioned where she could see both the road approach and the tree line to the north. She gave Rachel a single nod as she pulled in. Inside the house, a woman in her mid-30s answered the door, Tessa's sister, who introduced herself as Nina and had the look of someone who had been running on adrenaline for the last 2 hours and was beginning to feel it. Her daughter, 7 or 8 years old, was asleep on the couch under a blanket, which Nina had done deliberately to keep her calm and which had worked, and which Nina had accomplished while also making 3 phone calls and keeping her son,
a teenager who wanted to go outside and look, firmly inside by force of will alone. Rachel noted all of this without commenting on it because Nina did not need to be told she'd handled things well. She needed the next problem solved. Tessa was in the kitchen. She was younger than Rachel had pictured. Early 20s, slight build, dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd been ready to sleep when the phone calls started. She had a mug of something in front of her that she wasn't drinking, and her hands were flat on the table in a position Rachel recognized as someone consciously stopping themselves from fidgeting. The bruising from September was long healed, but there were traces of it in the way she held herself. A slight protective orientation to her right side, the kind of physical memory that takes longer to resolve than the visible injury. She looked at Rachel when Rachel walked in and said, "You're shorter than I thought." Rachel sat down across from her. "People say that." "You testified today. I read about it on my phone." A pause. "The judge laughed at your jacket." "He did." Tessa looked at her hands. "Logan Pierce told me after. He said nobody would believe me. He said his dad knew people." She said it without particular emotion, which Rachel understood meant the emotion was there but had been processed through many times. "I didn't tell the police because I believed him." "I know." "And then Ethan—" She stopped, started again. "I saw what Ethan did. I saw him come around the corner and I thought he was going to, but he stepped in. He got between us, and Logan went for him instead." She looked up, and then the story was that Ethan attacked Logan. And I let that happen, because I was scared. I let Ethan take that. Rachel looked at her steadily. "You were scared right after an assault. That's not a character failure. It feels like one." "It's not." Rachel paused. "But I need to ask you something directly. Can you testify tomorrow? Not whether you're willing, whether you can do it and stay together on the stand." Tessa was quiet for a moment. "What does stay together mean?" "Firth is going to come at you hard. He's going to question your timeline, your memory, your reasons for coming forward now. He's going to suggest you're motivated by something other than truth, settlement money, sympathy, animus toward the Pierces. He's going to be controlled and specific, and he's not going to raise his voice, and it's going to be worse than if he did." Tessa absorbed this. "And what do I do?" "Tell the truth," Rachel said. "Exactly what you remember, not what you think they want to hear, what you actually saw and felt. The second you start trying to manage the jury's reaction, you lose the only thing that can't be fabricated." A silence in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. From the front room, the faint sound of the sleeping child's breathing. "Yes," Tessa said. "I can do it." Rachel believed her. Not because she wanted to, not because the case needed her to, but because the way Tessa said it had the same quality as her own voice in the car an hour ago when she'd said, "I'm coming." Not a performance of resolve, just the thing itself. She stayed at the house until 2:30, going through the timeline with Tessa in detail. What happened, in order, starting from the beginning of her shift at the Riverside Grill on September 14th. Tessa's account was consistent, specific, and contained the kind of detail that fabricated accounts usually didn't. The brand of apron she'd been wearing, the name of the cook who'd been on break when she went to the back corridor, the sound the door made when Logan Pierce followed her through it. Rachel didn't coach her on any of it. She listened, asked clarifying questions, and let Tessa's own memory do the work. Whitmore's people stayed through the night. Rachel was back in Crestfield by 4:15 a.m. She did not go home. She went to Harlow Memorial, to the charge nurse's office, where she had a standing access code and a key to the secondary break room, and she slept on the narrow couch for 3 hours with her jacket over her like a blanket. She had slept in worse places on shorter notice. At 7:40, she was back in Coe's office. Coe had been up all night. It showed in the particular flat quality of her eyes and the 3 coffee cups on the table and the way she was speaking, precise and fast. All the courtroom modulation stripped away, just information moving as efficiently as possible. "State Bar received my call at 12:08 a.m., she said. "They've opened a preliminary inquiry into Firth's conduct. As of this morning, Firth is still on record as prosecuting attorney because the inquiry is preliminary and he hasn't been formally removed." She paused. "He walked into the courthouse 20 minutes ago." Rachel looked at her. "He's still going to try the case. He doesn't have a choice. Withdrawing at this stage would be an admission. He's going to walk in there and perform normalcy and hope the State Bar moves slower than the verdict." "Will it?" "It might.
Ko turned a page on her legal pad. But here's the other thing. The ISP responded at 6:52 this morning. Rachel went still. Ko looked at her with an expression that was too tired for drama, and so delivered the information as plainly as it existed. The IP address that accessed Harlow Memorial's records management system on September 17th traces to a specific service address. It is registered to a property at 4 Halcyon Drive, Brenton, Colorado. She paused. The property is leased by Pierce Property Group. It's the company's secondary administrative office. The silence that followed was the kind Rachel associated with a chest x-ray coming back with something definitive. Not the silence of relief exactly, but the silence before relief, while the brain was still catching up to what the eyes had seen. That's not residential, she said. No, it's commercial, and it has a staff registry. Ko flipped to another page. 7 employees are authorized for after-hours building access. One of them is the company's in-house counsel. One is Richard Pierce's personal assistant. She looked up. One is Officer Dennis Hartwell, listed as contracted security consultant. Rachel sat back in her chair. Hartwell has after-hours keycard access to the Pierce Property Group secondary office, she said. Yes. Where someone used remote access credentials to log into a hospital's record management system and delete evidence of an assault on a woman his employer's son assaulted. Yes. And Hartwell met with Richard Pierce and Daniel Firth last night. Yes, Ko said. And I have photographs of that meeting, a document access log, a staff registry placing Hartwell at a connected property, and a forensic document examiner who identified alterations in a police report Hartwell wrote. She set the legal pad down. It's not a theory anymore. Rachel looked at the table, the 3 coffee cups, the edge of daylight coming through the blinds. She was running on 3 hours of sleep and the particular clarity that sometimes came from exhaustion when the body decided there was nothing left to waste on anything except the essential. What time does Crane take the bench? She asked. 9. Then we have an hour. The courtroom at 9 a.m. M looked almost identical to the previous day's opening. Same gallery arrangement, same fluorescent light, same wood paneling, but the atmosphere had changed in the particular way that rooms change when something has shifted and everyone knows it, but nobody has said so yet. The gallery was more crowded. 3 people Rachel didn't recognize had taken seats near the back. 2 of them with legal pads, one with a phone already recording, which the bailiff would shortly ask her to put away. Press, or something close to it. Firth and Moss were at the prosecution table. Firth's jacket was fresh. His composure was also fresh, in the way that composure is when it's been deliberately assembled rather than naturally inhabited. There were edges to it, places where the construction showed. He didn't look at Rachel when she entered, and the fact that he didn't look was itself a kind of looking. Ethan was at the defense table. He looked at Rachel and then at Ko with the focused intensity of a man who had been told that today was critical without being told precisely why, and who was managing the space between those 2 points alone. Sandra Ko approached the bench before Crane was seated and submitted 3 items: the ISP compliance response, the Pierce Property Group staff registry, and a formal notification that new evidence material to the case had been received since the previous day's session. She did this without drama, in the flat administrative language of legal procedure, and handed copies to Firth's table simultaneously. Firth read the ISP response. Rachel watched him read it from across the room. She watched the point at which his eyes stopped moving, not at the end of the document, but somewhere in the middle, at the service address, and then moved again more slowly. She watched him set the document down and pick up his pen and put it down without writing anything. Crane took the bench at 9:04. Before we bring in the jury, he said, I understand there are new submissions. Mr. Firth, have you had a chance to review the materials? I have, Your Honor. Any objections to their admission? Firth took a breath that was almost imperceptible. The prosecution has some concerns about the chain of custody on the ISP document and would like the opportunity to examine the provider's compliance officer regarding The document was produced voluntarily by the service provider in response to a formal written request submitted by defense counsel, Crane said. The provider's letterhead, date, and signature are consistent with standard compliance procedure. Do you have specific, articulable grounds to challenge the chain of custody? A pause. We would need time to develop those grounds. How much time? Another pause. "Several days, Your Honor." Crane looked at him. "Mr. Firth, this case has been in motion for 4 months. The jury has been seated and is waiting. I'm not going to delay proceedings so the prosecution can develop a challenge to a document that arrived through normal legal channels." He looked at both tables. "The documents are admitted. Bring in the jury." Firth sat back in his chair. Moss leaned toward him and said something. He didn't respond. The jury filed in. Sandra Coe stood. "Your Honor, the defense calls Tessa Granville." The courtroom door opened. Tessa walked in. She was wearing a plain blue sweater and dark trousers, and her hair was down. And she walked the length of the courtroom aisle with the particular kind of care that people used when they were keeping themselves together by concentrating on each step individually. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the prosecution table. She looked at the defense table briefly, at Ethan Briggs, who looked at her with an expression that would have been difficult to describe, and then she looked at the witness chair and sat down in it. She took the oath. She looked at Sandra Coe. "In your own words," Coe said, "can you tell the court what happened to you on the evening of September 14th? Tessa told them. She started at the beginning of her shift, 6 p.m., tables 7 through 14, a floor manager named Gus, who'd been short-staffed and irritable. She described the restaurant's layout with the specificity of someone who had worked there for 2 years, including the back corridor that connected the kitchen to the service exit, which was used by staff to take out trash and by some of the regulars to smoke in the alley. She described Logan Pierce, who had been at table 9 with 3 companions, who had been drinking since before she started her shift, who had spoken to her in ways that she'd learned to manage by staying briefly professional and moving on. She described his 4th drink and his 5th. She described what happened when she went to the back corridor at 11:03 p.m. to swap a trash liner. She did not use softened language. She described what he did with the accuracy of someone who had replayed it enough times that the details had become fixed, like the text of something memorized. She described the wall behind her and the weight against her and the specific location of the bruising on her wrists from where he'd grabbed. She described the moment the service door at the other end of the corridor opened and Ethan Briggs walked through it. "What did he do?" Coe asked. "He said, 'Hey,' just that, just loud enough to make Logan stop." Tessa paused. "And then he said, 'Walk away.' And Logan turned around and he was so angry, that kind of angry where they're looking for somewhere to put it, you know? And Ethan was just there. Ethan was just standing there like he wasn't afraid of anything." A short pause. "And I thought, I think Ethan knew. He knew what was going to happen next. But he didn't move." "What happened next?" "Logan went for him, and Ethan defended himself." Tessa's voice was even. "I ran. I should have stayed. I should have, but I ran and I called the hospital and I didn't know about any police report until weeks later. I didn't know Logan had filed anything." She looked at the jury. "And then someone told me what was being said about Ethan, and I thought I could just stay quiet. Because Logan's dad is... I knew who Richard Pierce was. Everybody in this county knows who Richard Pierce is." Coe said, "What changed your mind?" Tessa was quiet for a moment. "Somebody deleted my records," she said. "Somebody went into the hospital system and took out the photographs of what Logan Pierce did to me. And when I found out, I thought, if they were willing to do that, it meant they were scared of what I knew. And if they're scared of it, it's worth saying." She looked back at the jury with the steady, unperformed directness of someone who had decided they were done being afraid of something that wasn't worth being afraid of, and had made peace with the decision, if not yet with all of its consequences. The jury watched her. The foreman in the front row, construction calluses, had been leaning in since the previous day, was no longer leaning. He was sitting straight in a way that meant something. Firth's cross-examination of Tessa began at 10:22 a.m. He was controlled. He was specific. He did not raise his voice. He came at her timeline. "You said 11:03. The police report places the exterior altercation at 11:08. That's 5 minutes from the corridor to the exit. Is that your understanding?" And Tessa said yes. She thought it was around that. She didn't have her phone out. She wasn't tracking minutes. He came at her decision not to report. "So you consciously chose not to go to the police on the night of September 14th? She said yes. He noted this for the jury without comment. He came at her motivation. You reached out to the defense team, isn't that correct? Yes. You weren't contacted by them first? That's correct. And you're aware that Mr. Briggs, if convicted, may face civil exposure that could affect what a personal injury claim against him might yield. Tessa looked at him. Her jaw tightened. I'm not filing a civil claim. As of today. As of ever, she said. You can't know that for as of ever, she repeated. I'm not here for money. I'm here because what happened to Ethan Briggs was wrong, and I let it happen, and I'm not doing that anymore. Firth moved on. He was doing damage. Not enough, but some. He established timeline inconsistency as a theme, returned to it twice, built it into a structure suggesting Tessa's account was imprecise. He planted the word motivated in 2 questions without stating it as an accusation. He did everything right technically, and Rachel, watching from the gallery, gave him credit for it. He was very good under conditions that were becoming untenable, which was a certain kind of professional excellence, even in service of the wrong thing. The cross-examination ended at 11:17. Coe's redirect was 4 questions. The last one was, Ms. Granville, do you have any reason, to want Ethan Briggs harmed? Tessa looked at the jury. No, she said. He's the reason I walked out of that corridor. The jury was dismissed for lunch at 11:40. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Rachel was standing near the same window she'd stood at the previous afternoon when Coe appeared beside her looking like someone who had just finished a very long sprint and was beginning to calculate whether it had been enough. Firth got something out of the timeline, Coe said. Not enough. No, but the IP address. He's going to challenge it this afternoon. He has to. Let him challenge it, Rachel said. The registry is still there. Hartwell is still listed as a contracted security consultant at the same building the access point traces to. That doesn't disappear because Firth questions the document. Coe looked at her. You know what the problem is with this case? She said. It's almost too much. We've put so many pieces on the table that any individual one can be chipped at. Firth's strategy is death by 1,000 doubts. He doesn't need to beat any one piece. He just needs the jury to feel like the whole thing is too complicated to be certain about. Rachel considered this. It was a correct analysis. Then we need something that can't be chipped at, she said. What does that look like? Rachel thought about Hartwell, about a police report with 2 sections in different ink, about a man who attended a fundraiser, wrote a report, listed 2 witnesses who weren't in the restaurant's transaction system, and then appeared at a private meeting with a prosecuting attorney the night before testimony resumed. It looks like Hartwell in that chair, she said. Coe looked at her. He hasn't been called. He's not on our witness list. He's on theirs. Rachel looked at the courtroom door. They listed him in their original disclosure as a potential witness. They haven't formally withdrawn him. Coe was quiet for a long moment. If I call him on cross from their list, Firth objects. Crane might allow it, might not. Crane's been allowing things all day. Rachel, if Hartwell lawyers up mid-testimony, he's a police officer in a case that's connected to a state bar inquiry into the prosecuting attorney. He's sitting on a meeting he had last night at the Pierce property. Rachel turned from the window. He's not going to lawyer up. He's going to try to talk his way through it, because walking away looks worse, and he doesn't know yet exactly how much we have. Coe looked at her with the calculating expression of someone who was weighing risk against the shape of the room. If it goes wrong, then it goes wrong and we still have everything else, Rachel said. But if it goes right in front of that jury in a way they can't forget. A pause. The hallway noise moved around them. Attorneys, clerks, a courthouse security officer walking the far corridor. Okay, Coe said. I'll move to call him. Dennis Hartwell was a compact man in his mid-40s with the kind of even tan that came from time outside and the kind of neutral expression that police officers sometimes developed as a professional default. He took the oath with the practiced ease of someone who had testified many times and understood the architecture of a witness stand. He was listed on the prosecution's original disclosure as a potential witness regarding the events of September 14th, which was how Coe had the standing to call him despite Firth's immediate objection. Crane allowed it. Hartwell settled into the chair with his hands on his knees and looked at Coe with the relaxed attention of a man who thought he knew what was coming. Coe started with the report. Standard questions. Hartwell confirmed the date, the time, his presence at the scene. confirmed his signature on the physical document, confirmed the 3 witness statements. Rachel watched the jury watch Hartwell, attentive, familiar with this type of testimony, not yet particularly engaged. Then Coe said, "Officer Hartwell, are you familiar with the Pierce Family Foundation?" A beat, short, barely noticeable. "I'm aware of it." "Did you attend any events hosted by the foundation in the 12 months prior to September 14th? "I may have." His voice was still even. "I attend a number of community events in my capacity as, specifically, on August 2nd of this year. Did you attend a fundraising dinner at the Millhaven Conference Center hosted by the Pierce Family Foundation?" Hartwell's hands on his knees adjusted slightly. "I believe I did, yes." "Was Richard Pierce present at that event?" "He would have been, yes, it's his foundation." "Did you speak with him?" "Briefly, it was a large event." Coe moved without pausing. "Officer Hartwell, are you currently listed as a contracted security consultant with Pierce Property Group?" The adjustment in his hands was more visible this time. "I do some contracted work, yes." "For Pierce Property Group specifically?" "Among others." "Do you have authorized access to Pierce Property Group's secondary administrative office at 4 Halcyon Drive in Brenton?" Firth rose. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance." "Goes to bias and relationship, Your Honor," Coe said. Crane. "Overruled. The witness will answer." Hartwell looked at Coe. "I have keycard access to that building for security-related functions." "Yes." "Where were you at 11:04 p.m. last night?" The courtroom changed. It was subtle, a collective shift in attention, the way a room's ambient noise drops when something suddenly matters. The jury foreman straightened. The young man at the end of the second row looked up from his own hands. 3 of the gallery observers leaned forward simultaneously. Hartwell's neutral expression did not crack, but it stopped being neutral in the way that things stop being neutral when they're working too hard at it. I had a private meeting." "Where?" "A private residence." "Whose residence?" "I don't think—" He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "A private individual." "Was Richard Pierce present at this meeting?" A pause. "Yes." "Was Daniel Firth present at this meeting?" Firth was on his feet. "Objection." "Sit down, Mr. Firth." Crane's voice was sharp and clear. He was looking at Firth with the expression of a man who had made a significant decision, and it was visible enough that the gallery noticed it. "I said sit down." Firth sat. Crane looked at Hartwell. "Answer the question." Hartwell looked at the bench. He looked at Firth. He looked at the jury. He was working through the math of the situation, what denying looked like against what admitting looked like, with the visible effort of a man who had walked into a room expecting familiar terrain and found something else entirely. "Yes," he said. "Officer Hartwell," Coe said, and her voice was absolutely level. "Were you aware when you attended that meeting last night that the State Bar had been contacted regarding Mr. Firth's conduct in connection with this case?" Hartwell's face went still, in the particular way faces went still when the calculation completed. Before he could answer, the courtroom door opened, not quietly this time. 2 men in dark suits entered, different from the men Rachel had seen the previous afternoon, more official in their bearing, with the particular compressed efficiency of federal agents. Behind them, a woman in a navy jacket with a federal court identification badge visible at her lapel. They moved to the side of the courtroom, and one of them produced a folded document and handed it to the bailiff. The bailiff carried it to Crane. Crane unfolded it. He read it. His expression, which had been moving steadily towards something hard and purposeful all morning, settled into a complete stillness that was, in its own way, more expressive than anything he'd shown since the previous day's session. He looked at the federal agent near the door. "Is this what I think it is?" "Yes, Your Honor." Crane looked at Daniel Firth. Firth had gone pale in the specific blanched way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lighting. "Mr. Firth," Crane said, and his voice had a quality that Rachel had heard in senior officers just before a command that changed everything. "I'm going to ask you to step outside with these individuals." He paused. "Now." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Firth rose from his chair with the careful movement of a man trying not to let his body communicate what his face already had, and he walked toward the back of the room, and he walked through the door that the federal agents held open, and the door closed behind them. In the witness chair, Officer Dennis Hartwell was looking at the closed door with an expression Rachel had seen before. In the field, in the trauma bay, in the faces of people who had just understood that the situation they were in was significantly different from the situation they had believed themselves to be in when they woke up that morning. He looked at Coe. He looked at the jury. He looked at the document on Crane's bench, which Crane had not yet described aloud, which contained language that Hartwell could not read from the witness stand, but which, from the response it had produced, he could apparently estimate. Rachel watched him from the gallery. She watched the specific moment when a person who has been holding a position under sustained pressure encounters the thing that makes the position untenable. She watched Dennis Hartwell draw one breath. She watched him look at Judge Crane, and she watched him say, in a voice that was much quieter than any voice he'd used in the last 20 minutes, "Your Honor, I think I need to make a statement. Your Honor, I think I need to make a statement." Rut. Crane looked at Hartwell for a long moment. The courtroom had the particular stillness of a room where everyone was trying not to move, in case moving broke something important. "Officer Hartwell," Crane said carefully, "before you make any statement, I want to be certain you understand your rights in this proceeding. You are currently a witness, not a defendant. However, if what you intend to say may expose you to criminal liability, you have the right to consult with an attorney before continuing." Hartwell looked at his hands on his knees. He looked at the closed door through which Firth had just walked. He looked at the jury, 8 faces watching him with a quality of attention that was different from anything he'd encountered in a courtroom before. The specific focus of people who understood they were watching something that mattered. "I understand," he said. "I'd like to make a statement." Crane exchanged a brief look with the bailiff. Then he turned to the gallery. "I'm going to ask everyone in this courtroom to remain seated and remain quiet. This proceeding is still in session." He looked at Coe, then at the empty prosecution table. "Ms. Coe, given the absence of opposing counsel, I'm going to direct this testimony myself until the situation with Mr. Firth is resolved. Do you have any objection?" "No, Your Honor." Crane turned to Hartwell. "Go ahead." Hartwell had been a police officer for 19 years. He had testified in hundreds of proceedings. He knew how courtrooms worked, the rhythm of them, the weight of being on the stand, the specific pressure of having a room's full attention trained on what came out of your mouth. None of that preparation was useful right now, because what he was about to do was not testimony in the way testimony usually worked. It was something else, something that went in a different direction than everything he'd built in 19 years. And he appeared to understand that, and he was doing it anyway with the particular grim practicality of a man who had looked at 2 doors and calculated which one he could live with. "The witness statements in my September 14th report," he said. 2 of them were not collected on scene. The jury foreman stopped breathing for a moment, or appeared to. "The individuals listed, Marcus Delray and Paul Vick, I knew them from community contacts. I called them afterward. I described what I needed the incident to look like and asked if they'd be willing to sign off on statements consistent with that account." He paused. "They agreed. I wrote the statements myself and they signed them." Coe said quietly. "Why?" Hartwell looked at his hands again. "Richard Pierce contacted me the morning after. He said his son was in a difficult position. He said there were ways he could make things easier for me if I helped manage the situation. He stopped. "He had photographs from the fundraiser. There are things I did at that event that I would not want documented. He made clear he had documentation. The room absorbed this. He coerced you," Crane said. "It wasn't quite a question. He gave me a choice," Hartwell said. "I made the wrong one." He said this without self-pity and without the performance of remorse that sometimes accompanied confessions. He said it like a man reading a verdict he'd written himself. The 3rd section of the report, the description of who initiated the physical altercation, that was also altered. I added language after the initial draft to make it consistent with Logan Pierce's account. "Did you know about the hospital records?" Coe asked. "Not until after. I found out about the record access later. That wasn't me. I don't know who did it, but I was told it had been handled." He paused. "I didn't ask questions." The door at the back of the courtroom opened. One of the federal agents stepped back in, positioned himself near the wall, and gave Crane a brief nod. Crane acknowledged it with a slight movement of his hand and returned his attention to the witness.
Officer Hartwell, Crane said, I'm going to recess this court for 30 minutes. During that time, you will have the opportunity to consult with independent legal counsel. The court will arrange that for you. He looked at the jury. The jury will be escorted to the deliberation room. You are not to discuss anything you have heard this morning. We will reconvene at... He looked at the clock. It was 11:53. We will reconvene at 12:30. He brought his gavel down once. The sound filled the room. Rachel stood in the hallway outside Courtroom 4 and watched the organized movement of the next 30 minutes from a position near the window, which had become, over the past 2 days, something close to her observation post. Bailiffs moved. Federal agents spoke quietly into phones. A woman in a gray suit who had not been in the building yesterday appeared from the direction of the courthouse administrator's office and walked with purpose toward the federal agents. Sandra Coe appeared beside Rachel at 12:08, looking like someone who had just run a calculation she hadn't expected to run and was still verifying the result. The document they brought in, Coe said. It's a federal investigative referral. DOJ, White Collar Division. They've been looking at Pierce Property Group for separate reasons. Land fraud, something to do with a federal contract on a commercial development in Brenton. They picked up signals from our state bar notification last night and it connected to their existing file. She paused. Firth isn't just looking at a bar inquiry anymore. He's being interviewed as a material witness in a federal investigation. Jupikis? Igum. Rachel looked at the window. The parking lot was different from yesterday. More cars, 2 of them with government plates. When did the federal investigation start? 8 months ago, apparently. Coe ran a hand over her hair. Before Ethan's case. Before any of this. She was quiet for a moment. We didn't start this. We just walked into the edge of something much larger. Is that a problem? For us? No. Coe looked at her. For the Pierces? It's catastrophic. Rachel thought about that. About Richard Pierce, somewhere in Brenton this morning. Or not in Brenton, she didn't know. He might have been in the building. She didn't know where he was. Receiving information about what was happening in this courtroom while simultaneously navigating whatever the federal investigators had been building toward him for 8 months. 2 pressures from different directions meeting at the same point. That was a different kind of collapse than what Rachel had been working toward. Bigger, less controlled, with edges that would take time to fully map. Ethan, she said, I know. Whatever else is happening, Ethan needs this case resolved. Today. She looked at Coe. Can you move to dismiss? With Firth out and the prosecution's case effectively destroyed? Yes. Coe was already thinking through it. Rachel could see her doing it, following the procedural path. Hartwell's statement invalidates the witness accounts. The medical evidence Firth was relying on to establish severity of injury is undercut by the blood alcohol documentation and by Tessa's testimony. The physical altercation is now supported as defensive force by 2 independent accounts. She paused. Crane's going to dismiss. Make sure he does it before anything else changes, Rachel said. Coe nodded. Yes. She walked back toward the courtroom. Rachel stayed at the window. Colonel Whitmore materialized from somewhere to her left. She hadn't seen him coming, which was not unusual, and placed himself beside her without preamble. Firth's attorney arrived 20 minutes ago, he said. Personal attorney, not court-appointed. He was here fast, which means Firth called him last night. He knew, Rachel said. He knew last night that things were coming apart, and he called his attorney before he came in this morning. Which means this morning's appearance was a calculation. Whitmore looked at the parking lot. He thought he could still manage it. He was wrong. People usually are when they underestimate how far someone is willing to go. He glanced at her. Not pointedly, just a look. Your people confirmed the individual near the Granville property last night was a private investigator, licensed, registered to a firm in Brenton. The firm has done work for Pierce Property Group on 3 previous occasions. Rachel absorbed this. Surveillance. At minimum, he paused. Possibly intimidation. The investigator is being interviewed. Outside, a car pulled into the lot, civilian, moving slowly, and parked near the government vehicles. A man got out,
looked at the courthouse entrance, and made a phone call without walking toward the building. Rachel watched him. Something about his posture was familiar in the way that certain professional postures were familiar across contexts. Deliberate visibility, positioned where he could be seen. He wasn't hiding. He was being seen. "Press?" she said. "Local, I think. Someone notified them." Whitmore paused. "It wasn't us." It didn't matter much who it was. It was another variable in a situation that was generating variables faster than any single person could track, which was itself a kind of progress. The Pierce side had spent months maintaining control of information, and the walls of that control were coming down in multiple places at once. Walls that came down in one place could sometimes be rebuilt. Walls coming down in 4 places simultaneously were a different problem. "I need to get back inside," Rachel said. Court reconvened at 12:37. Hartwell had a private attorney beside him at the witness stand, a woman named Burgess, who had the clipped efficiency of someone who primarily handled criminal defense and had assessed the situation on arrival and given her client one piece of advice, which was visible in the way Hartwell sat: cooperative, contained, and no longer improvising. Crane addressed the room. "In light of testimony received this morning, and in light of the withdrawal of prosecuting counsel due to circumstances under separate investigation, this court is going to hear a motion from defense counsel before proceeding further." He looked at Coe. "Ms. Coe." Coe stood. "Your Honor, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges against the defendant, Ethan Briggs, on the grounds that the prosecution's case has been fundamentally compromised by the admission of fabricated witness statements, the documented destruction of material evidence, and the demonstrated conflict of interest of the prosecuting attorney." She set a single sheet of paper on the bench. "I have a written motion with supporting citations." Crane took it. He read it. He did not read slowly. "Is there any representative of the prosecution prepared to oppose this motion?" He looked at the empty table. Moss had not returned. The paralegal staff were gone. The table had the specific emptiness of a position that had been vacated rather than simply vacated for a break. Silence. "The motion is granted," Crane said. "All charges against Ethan Briggs are hereby dismissed with prejudice." He looked at Ethan. "Mr. Briggs, you are free to go. The court apologizes for—" He stopped. He seemed to reconsider the word apologizes, which was inadequate, and the pause was visible to everyone in the room. "The court recognizes that you have been subjected to a proceeding that was compromised from its foundation. The dismissal is with prejudice and unconditional." He brought the gavel down. Ethan sat at the defense table and did not move for a moment. He had his hands flat on the surface in front of him, the same position Rachel had noted the first day, and he looked at them as if verifying that they were there. Then he looked at Coe, who nodded at him with the restrained expression of an attorney who had learned not to celebrate in courtrooms. Then he looked at Rachel. Rachel looked back at him. She didn't nod this time. She just held his look for a moment, and then she looked away because the moment was his, and she didn't want to be in the center of it. Around them, the courtroom broke into sound, controlled but sustained, the kind that happened when a room full of people released tension they'd been holding in different increments. The gallery moved. People stood. The man in the front row of the jury, the foreman, construction calluses, had been leaning forward for 2 days, stood with the deliberate movement of someone who needed to be on his feet and wasn't sure what to do with himself now that he was. Outside in the hallway, 30 seconds after the gavel, the noise was different. Fuller. Rachel stood near the courtroom door and watched it. Attorneys she didn't know, courthouse staff, the 2 reporters who had been in the gallery moving toward their phones. Hartwell was being escorted somewhere with his attorney, his face composed in the way faces composed themselves when the decision had been made and the only remaining task was to live with it. Ethan came through the door at 12:44. He stopped when he saw Rachel, and for a moment he didn't say anything. He was 34 years old, and he looked older by some increment that wasn't years, but something else. The residue of 4 months of carrying something that wasn't his. He had the slightly dazed quality of someone who had been braced against an impact for so long that its absence was its own disorientation. "You should go home," Rachel told him. "I don't—" He stopped. "My apartment's been— I've been at my brother's place." "Then go to your brother's." He looked at her. "How did you know? About Tessa? About all of it?" "You told me something was wrong," she said. "You were right. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. His eyes were bright, in the way eyes were bright when someone had been holding something back for a sustained period and was now in the specific complicated position of not needing to anymore. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you since the day you walked in. You don't have to say anything. Rachel, Ethan. She said it quietly, but it stopped him. You've been through something that took a significant piece of you. Whatever you want to say to me can wait until you've had 3 days of sleep and a meal that isn't courthouse vending food. She paused. Go to your brother's. Call me next week. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. Once. Slow. The nod of someone who was accepting being taken care of by someone who was better at it than he currently was. And he walked down the hallway. Rachel watched him go. She was tired in a way that had moved past the surface of things and settled somewhere structural, the kind of fatigue that required more than sleep to address. She was also, beneath the tiredness, something she would have had difficulty naming precisely. Not satisfied, because satisfied implied a cleanness the situation didn't have, but something like the state a trauma bay reached when the patient had stabilized and the immediate crisis had passed, and the larger, slower work of recovery could begin. She was pulling on her jacket in the hallway, the olive green canvas, the patch facing out, the worn zipper that caught at the bottom and required a specific angle to close, when her phone rang. The number on the screen was the main administrative line for Harlow Memorial Hospital. She answered. Ms. Voss? The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Osei, the hospital's chief medical officer. Osei was 61 years old and had been running Harlow Memorial for 9 years and had the kind of direct manner that came from spending decades in rooms where clarity was more useful than comfort. Rachel had worked under her for 3 years and respected her without finding her particularly warm. Are you still in Crestfield? I'm in the courthouse hallway. I've been watching the news alerts. A pause. You've had a significant 24 hours. Longer than that. Yes. Another pause, different in texture, something deliberate in it, something being decided. I received 3 separate communications this morning regarding your employment at Harlow Memorial. Rachel went still. What kind of communications? Professional complaints, submitted through the State Nursing Board's formal process. They arrived in sequence, the first at 6:14 a.m., the second at 6:51, the third at 8:02. Osei's voice was precise in the way it was when she was presenting clinical information. They allege improper access of patient records, breach of patient confidentiality, and conduct unbecoming a licensed nurse. Rachel leaned against the wall. The hallway moved around her, people passing, a clerk with a cart of files, someone's phone ringing in the distance. They're from the Pierce side, she said. I assumed as much. Osei paused. The timing is not subtle. No. Rachel. The use of her first name was notable. Osei rarely used it. I want to be direct with you. The complaints are filed. They exist in the system. I cannot make them disappear, and I wouldn't do so even if I could, because the process exists for a reason, and that reason is patient safety. A pause. But I have also reviewed this morning the compliance report that forms the basis of your testimony. I have reviewed the access log you submitted to Defense Counsel. I have reviewed your 17-year employment record at this hospital. Another pause. And I have retained outside counsel to represent the hospital's position in the nursing board process. Rachel said nothing. The complaints allege that your access of those records was improper, Osei continued. Our compliance director reviewed your original request 8 days ago and approved it under the hospital's third-party legal proceeding protocol. The access was documented, supervised, and entirely within policy. Her voice didn't shift. The complaints are without factual foundation. Our outside counsel will say so. Rachel exhaled slowly. Thank you. Don't thank me. The board process still has to run. It will take time. You should retain your own counsel independently of the hospital's position. Osei paused. But I wanted you to know where this institution stands before you heard about it from someone else. Rachel looked at the window at the far end of the hallway. Outside, 2 more cars had appeared in the parking lot. The reporter who'd been standing near his car earlier was now at the courthouse entrance, talking to someone Rachel didn't recognize. Dr. Osei, she said. Who filed the complaints? Two are anonymous. The third is filed under the name Richard Pierce as a concerned party. Rachel looked at the window. She thought about Richard Pierce, who had not, as far as she knew, appeared in this courthouse, who had been in Brenton when Firth visited last night, who had filed a nursing board complaint at 8:02 this morning, while his prosecuting attorney was walking into a courtroom that was already coming apart, doing things simultaneously, in parallel, the way people did when they were trying to build multiple lines of attack because they understood that the central line was losing. A man who filed a professional complaint at 8 a.m. against a nurse who had just helped expose his son's assault and his own obstruction campaign was a man who was still fighting. A man who was still fighting could still do damage. "Thank you," she said again and ended the call. She put the phone in her pocket and stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the fabric of her jacket. The hallway noise continued around her. Someone laughed at something nearby, a courthouse clerk, a short, easy laugh that had nothing to do with any of this, and the ordinariness of it was its own kind of steadying. Whitmore appeared from the direction of the courtroom doors. He looked at her face and read something in it. "What happened?" "Nursing board complaints," she said. "Filed this morning. Pierce's name is on one of them." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "He's not stopping." "No." "Firth is in a federal interview. Hartwell has counsel and is presumably cooperating to manage his own exposure. Logan Pierce—" He paused. "We should talk about Logan." Rachel looked at him. "What about Logan?" "He's been in contact with a defense attorney in Denver since last night," Whitmore said carefully. "Not the family's usual firm. Someone he retained independently." Rachel considered the significance of this. Logan Pierce retaining his own attorney independently of his father's firm on the same night that everything started coming apart in this courtroom. Not the same attorney, a different one. "He's separating from his father," she said. "That's one interpretation." "What's the other one?" "That he was advised to." Whitmore met her eyes. "By someone who told him that his father's exposure was significant enough that sharing representation would be a liability, not an asset." Rachel thought about Richard Pierce filing a nursing board complaint at 8:02 in the morning. She thought about Logan Pierce calling a separate attorney the night before. She thought about the shape of a family structure under extreme pressure, the way it could hold together until it couldn't, the way individuals inside it made calculations about their own survival that didn't always align with the collective position. "Logan knows something," she said. "Almost certainly. Something he hasn't said yet." "Something," Whitmore said, "that his new attorney may be evaluating as a negotiating asset." Rachel pulled her jacket closed and worked the zipper from the bottom, applying the specific angle. It caught once, and she corrected it, and it closed. "Is there a federal prosecutor in this building right now?" Whitmore looked at her steadily. "There is." "Are they the kind of federal prosecutor who would be interested in what Logan Pierce might know?" "They are the kind of federal prosecutor," Whitmore said carefully, "who has been building a case against Richard Pierce for 8 months, and would find it very significant if Richard Pierce's son chose to provide a voluntary account of events." He paused. "But that's not something either of us can move. That's Logan's decision and his attorney's strategy." "I know." Rachel looked down the hallway. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. The courthouse hummed around her, ventilation, footsteps, the particular drone of a building where decisions were made and their weight accumulated in the walls. "There's something else," she said. "The anonymous nursing board complaints." She looked at Whitmore. "2 of them are anonymous, which means whoever filed them knew to file anonymously while Pierce put his name on the third. Meaning someone else is managing part of this. Meaning someone with enough awareness to understand that Pierce's name on a complaint is potentially counterproductive given the current circumstances, but who filed anyway because the goal is process, getting the complaints into the system, creating a mechanism that runs regardless of what happens in the courtroom." She paused. "That's not Richard Pierce's instinct. He put his name on one. The anonymous ones required a different kind of thinking." Whitmore looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had followed her reasoning to its endpoint and arrived at the same place. "In-house counsel," he said, "the one with keycard access to the building the IP address traced to." Rachel met his eyes. "Who has not been named in any proceeding yet, who has not been called to any interview, who is, as far as the public record is concerned, a background figure in a property development company who hasn't done anything that connects directly to this case. Except authorize after-hours building access. Except that. She paused. And except file 2 anonymous nursing board complaints at 6:14 and 6:51 in the morning. Whitmore looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at her. You can't prove the anonymous complaints are from the same source. Not yet. Rachel looked down the hallway. But the board process requires a response within 30 days. In 30 days, a lot of things that are currently unclear will be considerably less so. Her phone rang again. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize. A Denver area code, different from any number she'd seen in the past 2 days. She answered,
Ms. Voss. The voice was male, professional, calibrated in the specific way of someone who chose words carefully for a living. My name is Garrett Solis. I'm an attorney in Denver, and I'm representing a client who has asked me to make contact with you directly. A pause. My client has information material to the Pierce matter and to your current situation with the nursing board. He'd like to speak with you, today, if possible. Rachel looked at Whitmore. He was watching her face with the same quiet attention he'd brought to 2 days of courtroom proceedings. Who is your client? She said. A pause on the other end of the line, short but calculated. The pause of someone who had prepared for this question and decided in advance how to answer it. My client, Solis said, is Logan Pierce. My client, Solis said, is Logan Pierce, but... Rachel held the phone against her ear and looked at the hallway wall across from her, plain institutional beige, a fire safety notice in a plastic frame, a scuff mark at knee height that had been there long enough to darken. She gave herself 3 seconds, not for composure, to think. Logan Pierce, who had assaulted Tessa Granville in a service corridor. Logan Pierce, whose injuries from Ethan's defensive response had been used to build a false prosecution. Logan Pierce, who had retained his own attorney the night everything fell apart and was now, through that attorney, reaching toward Rachel specifically, not toward Coe, not toward the federal investigators already in this building, not toward anyone with official capacity, toward her. Why me? She said. Solis's voice was measured. My client feels that you're the person who most accurately understands the full scope of what occurred. He believes a conversation with you, before any formal proceedings involve him, would be productive for everyone. Productive, Rachel repeated. He has information, Ms. Voss. Information that goes beyond what's currently in any court record or investigative file. He wants to provide it. He's trying to determine whether the people who receive it will use it correctly. Rachel looked at Whitmore. She held up one finger. He waited. Mr. Solis, she said, I'm not an investigator. I'm not a prosecutor. I'm a nurse who testified in a case that was dismissed 2 hours ago. Whatever your client knows should go to the federal investigators who are currently in this building. He knows they're there. A pause. He'll speak with them, but he wants to speak with you first. Why? A longer pause this time. When Solis spoke again, something in his professional calibration had shifted slightly. Not unprofessional, but less managed. Because his mother was a patient at Harlow Memorial 4 years ago. She was in your care for 11 days before she was transferred to a specialist facility. He says, Solis stopped briefly. He says you're the only person in 4 years who talked to her like she was worth talking to. He's been carrying that. The hallway noise continued around Rachel. Someone's cart of files. A door. Distant voices. She thought about 4 years ago. She thought about the faces that came through the trauma bay, through the general floor, through 11-day stays. She did not remember Logan Pierce's mother specifically. She had cared for hundreds of patients across 4 years, and most faces softened with time into a general sense of presence rather than specific memory. But she believed it. She believed it because it was the kind of detail that wasn't useful to fabricate, and because it explained the specific geometry of who Logan was calling and why, and because she had learned in 17 years that people's connections to their medical experiences ran deeper than almost anything else and expressed themselves in unexpected ways for a long time afterward. Where? She said. There's a coffee place 2 blocks north of the courthouse. Marin's. He's there now. Rachel ended the call. She looked at Whitmore. Logan Pierce wants to meet.
Whitmore's expression didn't change much, but his eyes did the thing they did when he was moving quickly through a calculation. Where? Coffee place nearby. He's already there. She paused. He says he has information beyond what's in any current file. You're going. It wasn't a question. Yes, I'll be outside, he said. Marin's was the kind of place that had been there long enough to stop trying. Mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu with half the specials erased, the good smell of actual coffee rather than the synthetic version. It was quiet at 1:15 on a weekday. 3 other customers distributed across the room without proximity to each other. Logan Pierce was at a corner table. He was 26 and looked younger in person than in the photographs Rachel had seen in the case file. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the faintly swollen look around the eyes of someone who hadn't slept. He had a coffee in front of him he wasn't drinking. His attorney, presumably Solus, was not present. Logan had come alone, which was either a gesture of sincerity or a strategic decision his attorney had approved, and Rachel didn't yet know which. He looked up when she walked in. He didn't stand. He watched her cross the room with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was discovering that the rehearsal hadn't covered the actual weight of it. She sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I know what you're thinking, he said finally. You don't, she said, not unkindly, just factually. He looked at his coffee. I didn't plan for it to go where it went. The night at the grill, I was drunk. I know that's not... It doesn't change anything. I know that. He looked up. But when my father started making calls the next morning, I didn't stop him. I told myself it would settle down, that it was manageable. He paused. It wasn't manageable. It just kept getting larger, and I kept letting it. And then Ethan Briggs was on trial, and his nurse was standing in a courtroom getting laughed at, and He stopped. I watched the news this morning. Rachel said nothing. My father filed a complaint against you, Logan said. With the nursing board. He told me about it last night before I called Garrett. He called it insurance. He thought it would slow you down. He looked at her directly for the first time. I want to tell you what I know, all of it, not just to the federal investigators. I want you to hear it first because you're the one who... He stopped again. My mother said you talked to her like she still had somewhere to be, like she was going to get better. She didn't get better, but she said it anyway. She said it in a way that mattered. Rachel looked at him. He was not a sympathetic figure in the conventional sense. He had done significant harm and had allowed a compounding of that harm that had nearly destroyed an innocent man. He knew this. It was sitting on him in a visible way, the weight of it, and he wasn't attempting to manage how it looked. That was, in Rachel's estimation, worth something. Not everything. Something. Tell me, she said. Logan Pierce talked for 40 minutes. He described the Pierce Property Group's secondary office at 4 Halcyon Drive, who had access, who used it after hours, the specific evening in September when he had been present and watched the company's in-house counsel, a man named Victor Slade, log into a system remotely using credentials he'd obtained from a hospital administrator who owed the Pierce family a professional favor going back 3 years. He described watching Slade navigate to Tessa Granville's file. He described what Slade deleted and why. He had not participated. He had not stopped it. He described the conversation the following morning in which his father had outlined the plan to manage the situation. Hartwell's role, the witness statements, the restructuring of the police report's narrative. He described being told to say nothing and to trust that it would be handled. He described trusting that. He described Victor Slade's name appearing nowhere in any current proceeding, and he described why. Because Slade had managed his own erasure from the visible record with the particular competence of someone who had been doing this kind of management for the Pierce organization for 11 years across multiple situations, none of which had ever reached a courtroom. He described the anonymous nursing board complaints. He knew who filed them because he had been in the room when Slade made the decision and the calls. 2 anonymous, 1 under Richard Pierce's name, Slade's calculation being that 1 named complaint from a concerned party created the appearance of legitimacy without exposing his own involvement. Rachel listened without interrupting. She asked 4 questions over the 40 minutes, all of them specific, all of them aimed at the structural load-bearing points of what Logan was describing, the parts that could be corroborated, the parts that existed in other records, the the parts that would survive cross-examination from a position of demonstrated hostility. He answered each one without deflecting. His memory was specific in the way that memory was specific when it was real, and when the person carrying it had been living with its weight for months. When he finished, she looked at him for a moment. "Victor Slade," she said. "Yes." "He's not in any current investigation." "No." "But everything you've just told me places him as the operational center of the cover-up. The record access, the deletion, the anonymous complaints. Your father made the calls and Hartwell executed, but Slade designed it." "Yes." Rachel sat back slightly. "Logan, what you've told me needs to go to the federal investigators today. Not tomorrow. Now." She paused. "I'm going to walk you back to the courthouse and introduce you to Colonel Whitmore, who will introduce you to the right people. And then I'm going to step back because this is not my jurisdiction, and it was never my jurisdiction. I was only ever here for Ethan." Logan looked at her. "Will it?" He stopped. "I know I'm going to face consequences. Garrett's been clear about that. I'm not trying to get out of consequences." "I know," she said. "I just need it to matter. What I know. I need it to actually do something." Rachel looked at him across the table, at the sleepless eyes, the untouched coffee, the particular quality of a person who had arrived at a decision through a long and damaging route and was now on the other side of it, uncertain whether the ground was solid. "It'll matter," she said. "Victor Slade has been invisible for 11 years. You're the thing that ends that." She stood up. He stood up. They walked out of Marin's into the early afternoon light, and Whitmore was where he said he'd be, and Logan Pierce walked back to the courthouse with a retired special operations colonel and told the federal investigators everything he had told Rachel, with his attorney present, in a formal voluntary statement that took 2 hours and 40 minutes to complete. Rachel did not stay for any of it. She went home. Cut. The 30 days that followed were not clean. They were not the swift resolution that happened in stories where the villain fell and the dust settled immediately and everyone went back to their lives with the weight lifted. They were 30 days of legal processes running in parallel, of phone calls from Co. and from the hospital's outside counsel, and from a state bar investigator who needed Rachel's account of certain events, of a nursing board process that moved with institutional slowness, regardless of the strength of the hospital's position. Victor Slade was arrested on day 11. The charges were extensive: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, unauthorized access of protected health records, and conspiracy to intimidate a witness, with the witness intimidation charge relating to the private investigator who had stood outside Tessa Granville's sister's house. His arrest was not front-page news in the national sense, but it was significant in Brenton and Crestfield in the specific way that the exposure of someone who has been operating invisibly in a community for a long time is significant. The retroactive rereading of a history that had seemed unremarkable. Richard Pierce was indicted on day 19 on charges that combined the pre-existing federal land fraud investigation with the new obstruction and witness tampering counts that Logan's statement had enabled. He surrendered at the federal courthouse in Denver with his original attorney, who was not Victor Slade, and was released on substantial bail pending trial. His photograph appeared in the regional news. A man in a dark coat, older looking than his age in the way that exposure sometimes accelerated, walking from a car to a courthouse entrance with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that every gesture was being observed. Logan Pierce pleaded guilty to assault in the 3rd degree in connection with the incident involving Tessa Granville. His cooperation with federal investigators was entered as a mitigating factor. He was sentenced to 18 months probation, mandatory counseling, and restitution to Tessa that his attorney had negotiated as part of a civil resolution she had agreed to separately. The resolution included a formal written acknowledgement of what had occurred, not a legal document designed to minimize, but an actual accounting, which Tessa had insisted on and which Solis had ultimately agreed to because Logan had insisted on it too. Tessa had asked for that specifically. Not the money, though the money was meaningful. She asked for the paper with his name on it saying what he did and that it was wrong, because she had been invisible in the official record for 4 months, and she wanted to exist in it now as something other than a victim who had been erased. She got it. Dennis Hartwell resigned from the Crestfield Police Department on day 7, before any formal disciplinary process could remove him. He was subsequently charged with filing a false official report and with obstruction of justice. His cooperation with investigators, partial, negotiated through his attorney, reduced but did not eliminate his exposure. He pled guilty on day 28 to a single count of filing a false report and was sentenced to 2 years probation and permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. The career he'd built over 19 years was gone in a proceeding that lasted 40 minutes. Daniel Firth's situation was more complicated and would remain so for considerably longer than 30 days. The state bar inquiry expanded based on his voluntary statement to federal investigators, which had been given under circumstances his attorney later characterized as coerced, and which the state bar characterized as relevant. He was suspended from practice pending a full disciplinary hearing. The federal investigators were still determining the scope of his knowing participation in the obstruction versus the degree to which he'd been a tool of the Pierce operation rather than an active architect of it. It would take months, possibly longer. The comfortable certainty with which he'd walked into Courtroom 4 on the first morning was not something he would carry into any room again for a very long time. Judge Walter Crane received a formal letter of admonishment from the State Judicial Conduct Commission for his treatment of Rachel during the first day's session, specifically for the word costume and for threatening contempt over the refusal to remove a garment with verified military significance. The letter was a matter of public record. It was not a severe sanction in the technical sense. In every other sense, it was exactly what it was, a formal, permanent record that a judge had used the authority of his bench to humiliate a witness and had been wrong, officially, on the record, for as long as records existed. Crane did not appeal the admonishment. The nursing board dismissed all 3 complaints against Rachel on day 23. The dismissal letter cited the hospital's compliance documentation, the approved records request, the absence of any breach of patient confidentiality, and the complete lack of factual foundation for the allegations. The 2 anonymous complaints were noted as having been filed contemporaneously with an active attempt to obstruct justice, which did not affect the board's formal analysis, but appeared in the written findings as a contextual fact. Rachel read the dismissal letter in the break room at Harlow Memorial between a 12-hour shift and a mandatory training session, sitting on the same narrow couch where she'd slept for 3 hours during the trial. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and went to the training session. Dusk. On the 31st day, Dr. Patricia Osei called Rachel into her office. It was the end of a shift, 4:20 in the afternoon, the particular gray-gold light of a Colorado October coming through the window behind Osei's desk. The office smelled of paper and the faint trace of the herbal tea Osei drank between meetings. Rachel sat in the chair across from the desk in her scrubs and her jacket, the zipper closed against the building's inconsistent heating. Osei looked at her for a moment before speaking. In the way she looked at things she was taking seriously. "The hospital has been approached," she said, "by the military's Office of Special Programs regarding a training initiative for emergency medical personnel working in austere environments. Field trauma care, triage under constraint, decision-making under sustained pressure." She paused. "They want someone who understands both the clinical and operational sides. Someone who can teach the principles without—" She paused again. "Without making it theoretical." Rachel looked at her. "They asked for you specifically," Osei said. "By name, through Colonel Whitmore. What does it involve?" "Quarterly. 3-day intensives. You would continue your full position here. The training would be scheduled around your rotation." Osei's voice was careful. "It is, by any measure, a significant acknowledgement of a service record that has been classified for most of your career." Rachel looked at the window. The October light. A strip of parking lot visible at the bottom of the frame, 2 cars, a tree that had lost most of its leaves. She thought about the courtroom on the first morning, the laughter, the word costume, the specific weight of being reduced to something lesser than you are by someone with the authority to make that reduction feel official. She thought about taking the jacket off, and the room going quiet, and Whitmore standing up from his seat in the 4th row. She thought about Ethan at the defense table with his hands flat on the surface. She thought about Tessa in the kitchen at 2:30 in the morning saying, "I can do it," in a voice that meant the thing itself and not a performance of it. She thought about Marcus, the 11-year-old from the crash, the first morning, the collapsed lung and the chest tube and the oxygen saturation coming back. She had checked on him twice since the trial. He was in physical therapy. He had sent her a card through the hospital's patient relations system that said, "Thank you for saving me," in handwriting that was still slightly unsteady. She kept the card in her locker. "Yes," she said. Osei nodded. She looked almost satisfied. In the restrained way, she looked almost satisfied with outcomes she'd anticipated correctly. "There's one other thing." Rachel waited. "The compliance team," Osei said, "has recommended a formal review of the hospital's records management security protocols based on the vulnerabilities exposed by the Slade access incident. They've asked for someone to lead that review." She paused. Someone with an understanding of both the clinical value of the records and the security risks. Someone who has already demonstrated they know how to find what's been hidden. She looked at Rachel steadily. "The role would be added to your existing responsibilities with commensurate adjustment to your compensation." Rachel looked at her. "You're giving me more work." "I'm recognizing the work you've already done," Osei said. "There's a difference." Rachel almost smiled. It was a small thing, and she was tired, and she had been awake for most of the last 31 days in ways that accumulated, but it was there. "Okay," she said. Yet, 3 weeks after that, Ethan Briggs came to the hospital. He didn't come as a patient. He came at the end of Rachel's shift, in civilian clothes, looking like himself in a way he hadn't during the trial. The excess weight of the prosecution gone from his face, replaced by something that was not quite peace but was moving in that direction. He brought coffee from Marin's, 2 cups, because he'd asked around and someone had told him she drank it black. They sat in the parking garage on the hood of her car, in the particular awkward way that people sat on the hoods of cars when the moment required some kind of informal closeness, but neither person was quite sure how to frame it. The coffee was good. The garage was cold and slightly echoey, a pigeon moving somewhere in the upper level with the soft, inefficient sound pigeons made. "I got a job," he said. "What kind?" "Community paramedic program. County's running a pilot for rural response. They need people who can handle medical calls in areas where ambulance response time is long." He looked at the coffee cup. It's not what I was, but it's close to what I'm good at. It's close to what you're good at, and it's useful," Rachel said. "That's not a consolation prize." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about what would have happened," he said, "if you hadn't looked at those records." "Don't," she said. "Rachel, Ethan." She looked at him. "What would have happened didn't happen. What did happen is that you're sitting on my car drinking decent coffee, and you have a job." She paused. "That's the only version we have to work with." He looked at her. "Are you always like this?" "Like what?" "Like..." He made a gesture with the coffee cup that was meant to encompass something he didn't have a word for. "Like nothing is allowed to be a big deal." Rachel thought about this. The parking garage, the cold, the pigeon somewhere above them, the compliance review she had a meeting about tomorrow, the military training initiative that started in December, the jacket hanging in her locker because she'd changed into her street clothes before coming down. "Things are allowed to be a big deal," she said. "They just don't get to stay that way forever. At some point, you have to put it down and go back to work." Ethan looked at the middle distance of the garage. "I'm not sure I know how to do that." "You're doing it right now," she said. "You showed up for a job. You're drinking coffee. You're talking to someone." She paused. "That's all it is. That's the whole thing." He didn't answer, but after a moment he nodded, slowly, the way people nodded when they were accepting something that was simpler than they'd made it and were not entirely sure whether the simplicity was a comfort or an insult, and were deciding it was probably both. They finished the coffee. The pigeon moved again above them, found whatever it was looking for, and went quiet. But the thing about a lie sustained long enough is that it eventually requires more maintenance than the truth ever would have. It requires people in place, records adjusted, versions coordinated, silence purchased at increasing cost. The Pierce organization had run that maintenance for years across multiple situations. The land fraud, the Hartwell arrangement, the Slade operation, and had done it successfully enough that it had started to feel like permanence. But permanence is what things look like before they move. Richard Pierce's trial was 18 months away by the court's scheduling. His bail conditions restricted his travel. His company's assets were under partial freeze pending the federal investigation's scope determination. Pierce Property Group's board had placed him on administrative leave, not out of moral clarity, Rachel suspected, but because the liability of his continued operational involvement had become actuarially indefensible. The company he'd built across 3 decades was running without him, managed by people who were in the process of carefully determining which parts of the operation were viable without the practices that had kept it competitive and which parts were not. Logan Pierce did not return to that company. He was living in a different city, working a job that Rachel didn't know the details of, attending the mandatory counseling that his sentence required, and, from what Solis had mentioned to Coe in a follow-up communication, continuing beyond the mandatory hours because he had decided the mandatory hours weren't enough. Rachel didn't know what to make of Logan Pierce in the long run. She suspected nobody did yet, including Logan. Some people faced with the consequences of who they'd been decided to be different people and managed it. Some decided and didn't manage it. It was too early to know which kind he was. It would be several years before anyone could say for certain. She found she could hold that uncertainty without needing it resolved. Victor Slade awaited trial. His attorney was filing motions. It would take time. It would conclude eventually in the particular grinding way that legal conclusions came, and when it did, the record would reflect what he had done. 11 years of operational cover-up, the deletion of evidence of an assault, the filing of false complaints against a nurse who had done her job correctly and then done considerably more than her job correctly. The record would say it. The record would say it permanently. That was, Rachel had come to understand, the thing that mattered most about official records. Not the temporary authority they conveyed, not the power they gave the people who controlled them in the short term, but the permanence. The fact that they lasted. That what was put in them stayed in them, and that eventually what was true found its way into them, whether the people with control over those records wanted it there or not. She had spent her career working with records, with the documentation of what had happened to human bodies under pressure, the numbers, the imaging, the notes, the times. She understood records as a form of witness, as the trace that remained when memory faded and individuals were gone and the specific texture of a moment had dissolved into the past. The nursing board's dismissal letter was in her locker, next to Marcus's card. The military training initiative paperwork was on her desk at home, signed but not yet returned. Her jacket was on its hook. On a Tuesday in November, Rachel Voss walked back into Harlow Memorial Hospital through the main entrance at the beginning of a 12-hour shift. She had the jacket on, olive green canvas, the patch facing out, the zipper at the angle that kept it from catching. The emergency department was already active in the way it was always already active, the particular organized urgency of a place where the work did not wait for anyone's readiness. The charge nurse, a man named Terrell, who had worked alongside Rachel for 6 years, and who had sent her a text during the trial that said, simply, "We've got it covered here. Go do what you need to do," looked up when she came through the doors. He looked at the jacket. He looked at her face. He handed her the shift report without comment. She took it. The first patient of her shift was a 47-year-old male with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal and not cardiac. Good news, delivered with the measured care that good news in an emergency department required, because the fear that brought someone through those doors didn't disappear with the diagnosis and needed to be addressed as its own real thing. The second patient was a teenager with a laceration that needed 6 stitches. The third was more complicated. A woman in her 60s, altered mental status, history that required careful sorting, the kind of case that took everything Rachel had and returned her to the essential truth of the work, that the person in the bed was the whole of it, and everything else was in service of that. She was 4 hours into the shift, in the corridor between Bay 3 and the nurse's station, when a medical student on rotation stopped her. Young, nervous, carrying a tablet in the way students carried tablets when they were compensating for uncertainty with documentation. "Ms. Voss," he said, I wanted to say, I heard about what you did at the trial." He stopped. Seemed to realize he hadn't framed this correctly. "I mean, I read about it. I'm from Crestfield, so it was, people talked about it, and I just thought," he stopped again. Rachel looked at him. He was 24, maybe 25, still figuring out how to stand in a hospital corridor with authority and not succeeding entirely. He would get there. Most of them did, if they stayed long enough and paid attention to the right things. "What did you want to say?" she asked. He looked at her jacket, at the patch. "I wanted to say that I didn't know people could do that. Just Decide to do the right thing when it costs that much. I didn't think that was real. Rachel considered him. Behind them, a monitor alarmed briefly and then settled. Someone had adjusted a lead. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and the coffee someone had left on the nurse's station counter. It's real, she said. It's just not easy. Those are different things. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, with the slightly too earnest nod of someone for whom something had just shifted into alignment, and went back toward his attending. Rachel turned back toward the corridor in Bay 3, and the 60-year-old woman with altered mental status who needed her full attention, and the 12 hours of work ahead of her that were the same as every other 12 hours of work, except that she was here for them, and that was sufficient. She had never needed to be remarkable. She had needed to be present and honest, and willing to do what the moment required when the moment required it, and to stand still when people told her to move and she knew that moving was wrong. That was the whole of it. Not the salute in this courtroom, not the military record, not the photographs in federal files or the commendations that now existed in public records where they had never existed before. Those things were true, but they were not the point. The point was the 11-year-old with the collapsed lung. The point was Tessa Granville walking into a courtroom in a blue sweater. The point was Ethan Briggs sitting on the hood of a car in a parking garage, figuring out how to put something down and go back to the work of being alive. The point was the work. Rachel Voss clipped her ID badge to her scrub pocket, straightened the jacket, and walked toward Bay 3. Some people waited to be seen before they acted. Some people needed recognition to confirm that what they knew was worth knowing. Rachel Voss had always understood that the confirmation came after, if it came at all, and that waiting for it was the one thing you could not afford. She had never waited. She never would.